Good morning. Excellent to see everyone. Thank you very much for coming along. So far, it's a very good session. A very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Hans Curlin. I'm the founder and managing director of CELO, and as a host the event today. As we know, it's on the specific topic of the Building Safety Act. So we hope this is going to be a day of learning and advice for all of us. At CELO, our mission has always been to simplify for our clients, and that has always been for our products and our services. And so over the last 2 or 3 years, we've really felt we've been missing a trick in that, and it needs to be more around the education. You know, the industry's gone over a huge changes over the last few years, and it's continuing to do so at a great rate. And with change comes sometimes some grey areas, and at CELO we have a certain amount of knowledge, which we're happy to share, but we don't know anything by far. So we rely on SMEs to help us, and this seminar is one of those ways that we can help provide learning to the industry. In bringing industry experts together, we can provide what we can, other experts can provide what they can, and we can bring it together because there's a lot to be learned from that. And help properly understand the legislative changes, because with the grey areas comes confusion, and then at the sharp end when things actually get onto the building project, that's when things start to go wrong. So if we can start to get things right at the beginning, that's going to help the entire industry. So the objective of this Building Better seminar is to expand the knowledge of the current and the future changes that are coming up. And we're going to be particularly focusing on the behavioural and the cultural changes that are required to comply within our businesses with the Building Safety Act. And it's going to be a fantastic day with some great speakers, some great panels. This is new, so I'm sure we're going to have some healthy debate, which is good, which is what we need. We would like it to be as interactive as possible, so if there's time there will be Q&A sessions through the day, which we would like everyone to participate in. There's no such thing as a stupid question. I know that for myself anyway, I have a lot of them.
And without too much further ado, I want to introduce you to Neil Bradley of SWECO, who's going to kick us off. He's going to give us a 20-minute overview of the Building Safety Act. And welcome, Neil.
Building Safety Act in 20 minutes, no problem. The day's going to be shorter than you thought. You can go home after my talk. I've been doing talks on the Building Safety Act since the documents came out in July 2022, and the talks I do normally about 45 minutes of talking. Then with questions, could be an hour. My world record, 5 hours of one practice. So now you can start worrying. I've done what you've all done, to be frank. I read the consultation documents, I read the primary, secondary legislation, I've been to talks, I've been to as many of the building safety regulator Q&As as I could, okay? And so I think what I'm going to talk about is I've got the intent, but I still feel like I'm in a sailing boat in an ocean of uncertainty, to be frank. And I think that's why we're all in the room today, because you may have read it, but actually working out what it's going to really mean, now we're into the operational side of it, is going to be quite difficult. So how do I condense 45 minutes into 20? Well, fortunately, we've got some youngsters in our marketing division, and they came to me a couple of weeks ago and said, Neil, we want your 5 priorities for the Building Safety Act, because we're going to put out an infographic. Now, when I started the industry in 1975, I wouldn't have known what that meant. In fact, I wouldn't have thought I'd be standing saying it now. But anyway, we've done this infographic. It's gone out, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the 5 priorities, in my view, that we've put out for the industry, and hopefully that will start the conversation, because in 20 minutes all I can do is start the conversation. Come on, maybe? So, what's going on there? There we go. So, my first thing is, are you a client, principal designer, principal contractor? Are you a duty holder? And let's get this straight now, because lots of people think this is just about HRBs, the work that's going to go to the building safety regulator. This is any building work that attracts a building regulation application has duty holders, okay, legally, and the duty holders are criminally liable for what they do. So when Hackett looked at the industry, I think one of the things she felt was that all too often designers and contractors on completion just walked away from projects, and the client really didn't understand their building. They didn't know how to manage it safely and efficiently, and certainly they weren't given the information to be able to do it. And so one of the things she wanted to do was make sure that stopped happening, because clearly the most important part of a building's life is in occupation. And so everything that's going on in the design and the construction phases should be geared up to allow whoever's managing that building to understand the building and do it safely, manage that building safely, and be given a building that complies. And on both counts, what Hackett found was buildings generally didn't comply when they were completed, and generally the clients didn't understand the building. So I suppose the key thing is for all individuals in the industry now, because what you're really criminally liable for is your competence. And if you take on work that you're not competent to do, then you're criminally liable for it. And I suppose this hierarchy is really easy to draw, you know. The primary role of the client as a responsible person is to ensure the principal contractor and the principal designer that they commission are competent to design, to construct the building they want, okay? And if they do that right, they've kind of fulfilled their duty for the design and the construction phase. Then you've got the principal designer is then kind of overall responsible for the competence of all the designers who are involved in the project. Similarly, the contractor's got to make sure that anybody who walks onto their job to do any work on the job is competent to do that bit of construction in compliance with the building regulation. That diagram, really easy. But you know already, I've just said the principal designer is really responsible for the competence of all the designers. Who's commissioning the design team at the moment? Probably not the lead designer. But even if the client or the principal contractor is bringing designers on board, the principal designer's got to be satisfied that they're competent. So the next question, if you're the client, principal designer, principal contractor, how are you going to plan, manage and monitor your project? So again, it is the CDM language, plan, manager and monitor. And we're constantly asked whether we can be the principal designer. Sorry, my background, I can introduce myself. How rude. My background's building regs, okay? I'm the head of technical standards and learning development at SWECO Building Control. So within building control, they say you can be PD, you understand the building regulations, and we're competent in terms of understanding compliance in the building regulations. Actually, we have set up a service that we see as being a consultant to the principal designer, because what we're not competent to do is coordinate all of the design activity. We're not competent to liaise with the client and with the principal contractor on design matters. We're not competent to really pre-assess the competence of all the design team. That's not what. So principal designer is much bigger, although you have a responsibility in terms of making sure the design complies. It's much bigger role than that. Third question, and I suppose this is where we go on to HRBs, and this is something that has occupied us and our clients quite a lot lately. Are we going to have to go to the building safety regulator, or are we going to benefit from the transitional requirements? The transitional requirement to not have to go with your work associated with a high-risk building is to have had your notice in and accepted by the 1st of October 2023, and then having been sufficiently progressed by the 6th of April 2024. So I suppose I ought to do it as we're here, just in case, but that's the scope of high-risk buildings. So buildings that are over 18 metres, 7 stories or more, are normally withdrawn at this point about why they put stories in, but I won't today. And containing 2 or more residences. The residential use does include student accommodation. See, I knew it would come. Includes student accommodation, doesn't include hotels and hostels, but I would say an apartment hotel falls into that definition because of the way they're used, okay? So if you know that coming, now though that type, the building safety regulator looks after cradle to grave. cradle to grave. Then the second set, over 18 metres, some stories and more, if it's a hospital and care home, they're just interested in design and build trades, gateways 2, gateways 3. Once it's completed, those the control of the in-occupation is done by different bodies under different legislation. So I mentioned sufficiency. This was one of the backtracks from, sensible backtracks from the consultation. So to benefit from the transitional requirements, you've got to be sufficiently progressed. So terrified the industry when it came out, because initially it was completely out of the ground, wasn't it? And now they've gone back to actually pouring a permanent foundation in association with the building. Okay, so that's what you need to have done to benefit from it. The one thing you've still got to do, though, even if you're benefiting from the transitional requirements, and this could be a project that you submitted a notice on 3 years ago and started a year ago, it doesn't matter. It's not got to be just a late project. If it is benefiting from the transitional requirements, you've got to put a notice into the local authority to say, we've started. Okay? And that's something you've got to do. Now, some of our clients are aware of it, some aren't. We're working with our client on their client list, and we'll send that to the local authority. The whole point of that is so the building safety regulator gets some kind of idea of the works that think they're going to benefit at the moment. We're going to trip over and go to them in April next year. And even if you are benefiting from the transitional requirements, so you can stay with your building control body through to completion, I think you've got to start gearing up in terms of the golden thread, call it what you will, because when you get the completion certificate, that will go to the client. The client's then got to register the building. They have that duty from that point on under the Act to have a building safety case in place before they occupy the building. They can't make a building safety case unless they understand the building and they've got the information. So even on projects where you're benefiting from the transitional requirements, you need to be managing your information so that the client can manage that building safely and fulfill their duties as a responsible person in occupation. Next question. And I think this is a big thing. Do you understand what the prescribed documents are? Because this Gateway 2 process, to be honest, the Gateway 2 process, I don't think, and I don't think the building safety regulator thinks, is really about checking the compliance of your design. Because from their point of view, if they get a design at Gateway 2 that doesn't comply, the principal designer hasn't fulfilled their duty, because they should be competent in providing a design that complies with the building regulations. So you've got this little 12-week, it's a hard stop, you can't start without it. So actually you want in your design to have complete assurance that when you go to Gateway 2, the design you give them does comply. And it's a kind of almost like a tick box exercise. I think what Gateway 2 is really about is this, is about these prescribed documents and understanding these. And this is where ultimately I think the building safety regulator assesses the risk in the building, understands what they're going to do during construction, and then can inform you what they want from you for you to get your completion certificate. Now this is the bit that probably makes 20 minutes into 45 minutes, so I can't do the prescribed documents in real detail. These all are issued in the client's name. Most of them are written by the principal designer or principal contractor. This whole Gateway process predicates against the design and build contract, which is deliberate because Hackett's view was that the design and build contract was one of the environmental conditions that existed in construction that allowed buildings like Grenfell to get constructed in such a non-compliant form. Okay, so this is about getting a really mature design laid out before you commence on site and then build to that design. So the one document that probably the client will author is the competence declaration. And this is their process for making sure that they've appointed a competent principal designer, competent principal contractor. Okay? They only look at the process, they don't look at the outcome. If it turns out one of those parties is incompetent, they'll go for them afterwards. Okay? So they just look at the process. But the rest, I think, is then put together for them. Building control compliance statement just says these are the standards we're using to show that we've met the functional requirements of the building regulations. You get rejected on that. You're building a 70-metre tower, and in your building regulation compliance statement, you say we're going to use approved document B as our guidance to prove compliance with regs. Rejection, approved document B is not appropriate for a 70-metre tower. Wrong standard. Foreign emergence file goes deeper than the compliance statement. It goes right back to those very, very early discussions with the client. The client says, we want this building, these kind of people are going in, they behave this way. So that allows the design team to start working out what standards are the appropriate standards to use. By the way, this is not just about Part B. This building regulation compliance statement is the standards you're going to use to show compliance from Part A to Part S, soon to be Part T. Okay? So it's bigger than just 5 precautions. And then the construction control plan, this is the one that will be written by the principal contractor. This shows how the principal contractor is going to fulfill their duty to build a building that complies with the building regulations and how they're going to have the evidence that shows they have. So what's their closures policy? Who's signing off on all the photographs? Have you got clerk of works? Are you using a third party commissioning engineer at the end? So all commissioning is independently witnessed. I chuck this in now, and I know it's the early days with it, but I know lots of contractors are looking into it, and probably one of the big pieces of assurance you can will be in this bit, because so many photographs are taken now, is the use of AI to scrutinise all images that are taken for contraventions. And that gives you a higher level of assurance around that. Then the big one, change control plan. Change is risk in this. If you've got a major change, you have to stop work on that element and wait probably 6 weeks. And if you haven't got a decision on 6 weeks, it's not deemed approved. The only thing the legislation says you can only start when you get approval. So if they take 10 weeks, you're waiting 10 weeks. Everyone costs money. Every change costs money that you put in. So I'll give you an example of what they give examples of where you could do a staged approval and withhold information. But I don't think there's a lot of examples that really you can do that on. Certainly one thing that you probably don't get designed right to the nth degree at the beginning of projects at the moment, but you will do for Gate 2 is an external wall. External walls got to be completely specified, all products, all dimensions. Any change in the construction phase to the external wall design, products or dimensions, major change, stop work on your wall, wait. That's it. Now another area which the talks come on later, and I'm doing this, fire stopping. I think for those products, those important products that go into a building around passive fire precautions need to be specified by product. I don't think they'll accept a kind of functional specification, which Gateway 2. And then you've got to look at, if you change a product in there, whether that change is a major change, because if there's a change in the fire performance, and you've got to look at how that works, and I'm going to leave that for the next one, that could be another stop work on that particular element. Wait. Here's a big one. So before, and actually this isn't just with high-risk buildings, this is anyone. Now the clients and the duty holders during the construction phase, to get your completion certificate, have to make a statement that we're asking you for your completion certificate and the building complies. I think this is where the golden thread comes in really important in both cases, really, because the clients also got to say, both for HRBs and for any other work, we've received all the information about the building and we're happy with it. So we're holding that, and they've got to confirm that now, which again is a change to how we used to behave, say, for Regulation 38 information associated with the building. So this is quite a big change. They will not, it's going to be digital, they won't say what digital is, and I think they're right, don't say what digital is, because the consultation came out in 2022, in 2030 everything's going to move on. They want the golden thread to be in the best environment possible that you can get at the time. The one thing about it is, again, going back to where I started here, the biggest part of the golden thread's life is when the building's occupied. And the client, the building safety manager, has got to be able to manipulate change, add to it. They need to be putting in all the testing they've done, all the maintenance they've done, perhaps management training. Certainly if they've done any material changes on the building, they need to put that in too. So actually, in talking to some of our really big clients who are big developers, I've said to them, are you developing this as a client requirement rather than, at the moment, probably where information is manipulated is dictated by the contractor, and they're saying, yes, we're saying how we want this information because we're the ones who are going to use it in anger, to be frank. So yeah, to get your completion certificate and the building safety regulator take 8 weeks to do this. You've got to make this declaration. You give them the golden thread. The golden thread you give them is larger than the one that you're going to give to the client, because that's going to have all your updated prescribed documents, all your change control, all your as-built, everything that's in your construction control plan in terms of evidence of compliance go to them. They look at that. They'll reconsult with the fire brigade, but then they'll also send out the inspectors to corroborate the evidence you've sent them. And that's the way they work on site. They look at evidence first, then corroborate it right the way through the project. I don't like ending on a low note, but I'm only starting the conversation. I just wanted to remind everybody what I've talked about. If you fail in your duty, it's criminal. If you're an entity, the courts can give you an unlimited fine. If you happen to be an individual, you can get a custodial sentence too. Hey, did you hear that buzz? That's the end of my 20 minutes. Thank you very
I'm
much.
going to move straight on, if that's okay, straight to the panel, which is going to be chaired by Harry Perm, or CELO. On the panel, slight tweak to this agenda here on one of the individuals, but to start we've got Nasa Bill from Scott Brownrigg. I'd like to welcome her up to the panel. Got Tom Gilbert of CLM Group, fire stopping, Tom? CLM Group? Fireproofing.
Just so people know.
Just so CLM fireproofing.
Not fire stopping,
And then we've got Douglas Masterson from Guild of Architectural Ironmongers.
Good. Thanks, Lewis. So yeah, I think that was a really good tone set for the day by Neil there, so thank you. There's always two ways to look at change, isn't there? Naturally, I think the human being doesn't really like change. And I'm just going to say it because I'm behind a podium, so I've got protection, especially in the construction industry. But I think there's always opportunities to come out of change as well. And what I'm really interested to hear from these 4 experts that have been involved in the current or what will be the previous way of designing and building, especially high risk buildings, but all types of buildings, how this new gateway process will affect them and their companies and the projects they work on. So, nice. I think I'll start with you. Sorry, if that's all right. In regards to the gateways 1 and 2, how do you see this affecting what you do as an architect's practice throughout your difference between what you're doing at the moment and what you'll have to do going forward in terms of the extra work, maybe right from pre-planning right the way through to tender and contract?
Well, I think Gateway 1 is something that we were probably doing a lot of anyway. So Gateway 1 is just meaning that you need to provide a fire statement with your planning application, and for all residential buildings we probably would have tried to do that anyway. When it comes to Gateway 2, I'm going to take something out of my talk later, so I'm going to repeat it. But as designers, we like to design buildings sequentially. So each package informs and interfaces with the next package. So it's really an iterative design process. However, now with Gateway 2, we're going to have to do everything up front, and we're going to have to get contractors to come in much earlier and specialists to inform the design to make sure that we're not elongating the design process. Because I think one of the biggest things for us is that clients are going to still want the same design program to get to site, but obviously we have to do a lot more work to be able to achieve that. So it's about finding the optimum time for contractors and specialists to come in to integrate with our design.
Yeah, okay, so do you see that being able to kind of keep to that program by involving a contractor earlier, or how will that?
I think it's definitely going to elongate the program no matter what, because you've got potential for pause periods and inactive periods when we've submitted the building safety, the information to the building safety regulator. And I think one of the other biggest things is designing and costing the building up front and not having the opportunity to value engineer and change going forward. So I think it's going to elongate the process anyway. We're just going to have to find a way to, as designers, design more efficiently.
Yeah, that's good. Tim, have you got any comment on that being coming from a contractor point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that stuff is essentially forcing us to do the right thing that we should, through our own volition, be doing anyway. I think, you know, historically, it's a shame, but we've proven as an industry we're not capable of doing it without some different re-engineering of processes. So I think from a contractor's point of view, it kind of pushes a lot of the mantra that we all talk about, but we don't necessarily do. So early involvement of consultants, of a contractor, working together to get things right. I hate VE, I hate change.
So do we.
You know, the VE is not VE, it's a product substitution, often for an inferior product. You don't get something for nothing. So I think the whole intent to make sure that you do it right day one, you fix it, and then you do what you should have done in the first place is music to my ears, to be honest with you. So yeah, I welcome it.
Yeah, that's good. And just on that VE point, Tom, I know we were discussing it a couple of days ago. The definition of VE is probably taken a bit of a turn, and maybe we should go back to what it actually means.
Yeah, I suppose the I totally accept the point around VE is, you know, a pain for everybody, but I mean inherently VE is kind of a natural process in design, particularly, and you know, and the analogy I use is, you know, VE doesn't always have to be make it worse from a safety perspective or make it a lower quality. I mean, sometimes it's just about making sure the architect doesn't design your high-rise building out of gold, right? Sometimes VE is, obviously that's the extreme, but
So we need someone to
yeah. But I mean, you know, the reality of development, having worked for a developer and worked through many designs, there does come a point where, you know, the project is massively over budget before you're anywhere out of the ground. So value engineering sometimes just has to happen, you know, and I think maybe we've got into a point where we've assumed that VE is naturally a deterioration of safety provision rather than potentially a necessary budgetary constraint.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think it's important to see that because VE's become a dirty word, isn't it, in the industry. It doesn't necessarily have to be, I don't think, but it's all about doing it the right way.
Yeah.
So that's good. Douglas, I don't know if you had any comment further to what Nias was saying with regards to the design and specification process.
Yeah, well, the trade association who I work for, with the Guild of Architectural Ironmongers, so the GAI. So, and we teach people how to specify ironmongery. That's part of what we do. So, most projects that you'll be involved in, somebody somewhere will have been sitting down initially with a set of drawings and compiling that list of ironmongery. We are all in favour of the spec maker and less in favour of the spec breaker. And I think if there's one thing that's coming out of this is that increased onus on the spec maker. Value engineering, VE, is very often extremely bad news for the ironmonger because we sit at the tail end of the project when all the money's run out and there's no gold left for the handles. So
Collective.
yeah, so there we go. So yeah, so our members are the ones who are very squarely in the focus of that. So getting that specification, getting it right, getting it to budget as well, which is a key aspect, one of the things that we always get across to our own members. It's all very well specifying the very, very top end of ironmongery, but it's ensuring that you get it right and that you get it on budget. And ensure that it's fit for purpose. So just continued onus on that specification making process.
That's good, thank you. I wanted to move on, if I can, to perhaps a slightly controversial subject. Tom, I'll go to you first in regards to the second staircase. I know you've made comments on this to me before. I'm really interested in because it is controversial for a reason, and I can actually, I've heard and can understand both sides of the argument, but I think it's very interesting for everyone to understand the reasons behind it and what we should, is the argument strong enough? I think, Nias, you mentioned it recently as well, is the argument strong enough for a single staircase to remain? So, I don't know, could you just give maybe a slightly bit of background
Yeah, I'm really pleased that you mentioned controversy and then my name immediately after.
I was going to say keep it clean.
That'll be the soundbite, won't it? Social media, and then it's me. I think, I mean, from my perspective, having worked through, well, I've worked in the industry for 21 years. I really did start when I was 5, and that's hard to believe. But I think having worked in residential buildings for as long as I can remember, and you know the vast majority of the buildings I've ever walked around, ever designed, ever built, have all had a single staircase. So I think there comes a point where eventually you have to you realise that everything that you've done for 20 years is fundamentally incorrect, or you have to look at why we are where we are. And I think obviously the Grenfell Tower disaster very much focuses the mind on what we did previously and what we should be doing in the future. And I think the 2 staircase situation is professionally maybe a step too far in terms of extreme prescription of 2 staircases in all buildings over a certain height. And I think the reason I sit in that is not because it's a reflection of, well, everything I did for 20 years can't be wrong and being arrogant about it. It's not that at all. Obviously, the reality is that from a fire engineering perspective, I don't necessarily believe there is enough evidence or testing or any real merit in just simply prescribing 2 staircases and simply saying because there's 2 it's twice as good. And I think there are a number of factors that will affect 2 staircases, and actually the thing that people won't necessarily acknowledge is that 2 staircases in theory could make a fire worse, and I think without that appropriate consultation, we are in a situation where designers and developers are on hold in a lot of places. They are adding 2 staircases for the sake of it. They're adding 2 staircases to designs that if they actually went back to the beginning with the mantra of 2 staircases, would never have started to design it the way they have. So they're being crowbarred into the wrong parts of the building, which is putting buildings that potentially were on the edge of financial projections being far over. So as a result of that, buildings aren't going to get built. And then beyond that, we're going to reduce the number of space in the buildings that we're creating. And for what? And fundamentally, it's simply that building regulations are just a manifestation of social perception. That's what they are. And I think the trouble is society has decided via media and via government that the answer is 2 staircases, and I'm not convinced that is the answer. I think the Building Safety Act is the answer, and I've got problems with the Building Safety Act, I'm sure we all have. But I think, for me, prescription you just remove competency by prescribing things. I think people just won't be thinking in the right way because the book says do that, so I'll do it, rather than is that appropriate for the building I'm designing? Let me think about it, and let me think about it in a holistic risk approach, and I don't think that's going to happen. So that's my concern about 2 stairs.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, it's a good point, should there be, and I'll come to you, Nigel, on it, should there be maybe something more there where there's stipulations that if the building's in this scenario, you should have it, for instance?
I completely agree with Tom. I think perception in the public is that high-rise buildings aren't safe, and so an easy win is to say let's mandate put a second stair in, and everyone goes okay, it's safe. However, what we're finding is that a lot of buildings that we've designed that we're now having to do second stair in, the client is saying just put a second stair in that position there, but it's not a true second means of escape from apartments, and therefore it's not actually solving the problem at all, but it's a tick box exercise. So I mean, interestingly, I do a lot of international residential work as well, and I was talking to some of my clients in New York and Cyprus, and they were all saying, well, why haven't you got 2 stairs? It's something that they've done from the start anyway. But I think it's exactly that, it's a tick box exercise, and the safety of a building should be holistic, and a staircase is a very small part of that safety, and we need to make sure that all other aspects of the building are thought about and not just the stair. And I was at a conference recently, and there was a fire engineer who gave some stats about fires in residential buildings. And although obviously in high-rise buildings the overall issue could be a lot worse, the majority of fires actually happen in low-rise residential buildings. And so we need to make sure that this Building Safety Act and everything that we're doing is actually working for small buildings as well as higher buildings, high-rise buildings. But I think it's also interesting, going back to the VE point, what clients need to do now is understand that the efficiencies of buildings, by putting 2 stairs in, is going to go down slightly. And so they need to understand that, you know, your return might be less. And so if we talk about value engineering, that needs to be thought about right at the start, rather than at the end when they realise it's not going to get as much return and then let's take something out of the building.
And I think that's the point of the situation that people have found, is that the second staircase mandation that's just happened, I mean, initially it just happened in London, right? The mayor just said, well, it's happening here, and then sort of blamed the government a little bit. But I think, I think all of a sudden, the kind of value engineering was just went on steroids, right, on all of these high-rise buildings. So actually what happened was, we'll mandate a second stair, that will make it better. And then all of a sudden, value engineering happened at an incredible rate to get it back on budget. So you would have actually, in theory, made potential things worse just by taking away all that potential space that you were going to sell for no tangible safety benefit at all. You know.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Tim, you're looking quizzical.
That's just the way I look. I think this is a nuanced argument, isn't it? There's lots of different things to it. I mean, I think we have to be careful, because playing devil's advocate, precedent doesn't make something right, and just because a risk didn't manifest itself into reality doesn't mean that risk didn't sit there anymore. I don't think we should let economics drive the solution, but I do concur with what was said earlier, which is about ultimately if we're getting the right competent people in place to design and specify these buildings and lay them out, then ultimately we should trust in their competency as long as it can be approved. You know, we have to. What I do welcome is more stringent approaches around that competency, because I've equally seen in the past, not most other lives, engineering assessments being abused, basically, where people have used an engineering assessment to justify things that probably are on the borderline of what should be acceptable or otherwise. So I think, in a way, if you've got to trust in the process, if the process is right and you've got competent people doing competent things, then ultimately, then there should be nuance to it, and you take it on a holistic view as to what a building should do. That's what I see on it.
That's interesting. Douglas, I don't know if you've got any particular comment on that.
No, there's not too many door handles in the staircase.
just checking. Gave you an opportunity for diversification, but you didn't take that. Just quickly before we move on to Gateway 3, on Gateway 2, I think a massive perception, I think Andy Jones is in the audience when we discussed recently, a big perception in the industry that Gateway 2 is all about fire and fire compliance. Whilst that is important, Gateway 2 itself isn't actually about fire itself. I don't know if you've got any comment on that, Liza.
No, that's right. It's it's about the safety of the building. It's about complying with all the different building regs. It's everything. It's not just fire, but obviously fire is at the forefront, and that's why people are sort of grasping onto the second stair. I think just going back to the second stair, one final comment is what we are creating now is a fear of single stair buildings, and we have a massive stock of single stair buildings. So what's going to happen to them? So I think we need to also educate people that a single stair building can be safe if the other measures are in place. So I think there's a whole sort of conversation around that.
The consultation was interesting, wasn't it? Because the consultation said we want 2 staircases, by the way, one's also safe. But the reason we want 2 is because one isn't safe, but they are really safe. You know, and it's just kind of, it breeds that kind of there isn't, you know, are we going to have a 2-tier situation where you've got single staircase buildings which either people don't want to live in or they're cheaper, versus 2 staircase things. And actually, I think you make a great point around, you know, the finances on it, and the fact that, you know, safety definitely shouldn't come at cost, right? We should be paying for what's necessary. And I don't actually think in the new world 2 staircase buildings are a bad idea, and I don't think in the old world a single staircase building was an idea, but a bad idea. I think the bad idea is the kind of the transitionary arrangement that just sits in the middle. That, you know, because it's the first time ever really that I've seen a mandated requirement without any guidance before it happened. So that was very bizarre, and I've seen lots of things change, but there was no guidance on what that meant for anybody, which is why designers did crazy stuff, or, you know, what they thought was right. But yeah, you're right, it's not about fire. at all. And I think actually it's a really good point. You know, is it all about fire? And it isn't. And Andy Jones, who we talk about, a colleague of mine for 4.5 years at Lendlease, and you know, the reality is, I think businesses who think it is about fire will just fail to deliver it properly, because fundamentally this is about process. You know, this is about building control, and it's about process, and it's about competence, and it's about all the stuff that applies to everything. It's not just about fire, it's not just about structures, it's definitely not about, I heard this, it's not about 9999, it's not about 9991, and it's not about single staircases, and we're like, well, of course it isn't. But obviously the people that think, well, Grenfell Tower, therefore Building Safety Act, oh, it must just be about fire. And I don't think people are involved enough in reading it would be a great start for a lot of organisations, I think.
Yeah, that's good. And Nigel, just finally, regards to the sign-off process that Neil was talking about with RFIs or potential alternative changes and so on, how do you see that playing out
Well,
for yourself?
I mean, our understanding is that the Building Safety Regulator will not accept a material change on the basis of cost, even if the performance of the material is the same. So I think it's going to be, I mean, we haven't done it yet, so we don't know exactly, but I think it's going to be a massive learning process, because obviously changing something is going to cause a pause period on site, and then, you know, an elongation in the programme. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, really. I mean, I'm not sure I have the answer right now, but I think it's going to be interesting.
And you don't think there would be, excuse me, would there be separate teams and so on that would deal with that kind of thing, or that would just be, that would kind of work as it still is at the moment? RFIs come in or alternatives come in, and you would deal with it with the same.
Yeah, I think it'll be the same process. It's just how many RFIs we're going to get. Are people going to be willing to change it with the risk of stopping the programme, or are people going to make sure right at the start that everything is as they want, costed correctly, and then start, which is essentially what we'll be trying to do. So it will be interesting to see.
So overall, are we saying that if that's done, so right at the beginning we've got everything right, so eliminating just about RFIs or VE options, things like that, do you see that whole build process, so asking kind of all of you really, but that whole build process from concept with the architect to completion, handing over to the client, as overall shorter or less expensive, or both? Because the design, the time spent, and I know Joe, you're a fan of this as well, if the time spent dealing with errors and snags at the end of the job is spent at the design end, does that then actually speed things up?
So I think from an architect's point of view, it is actually better for us, because obviously we want to design everything first, make sure it all stays the same, goes to site, builds exactly as we design it. So it should speed it up, because it takes out the issue of errors or changes. It's just whether it will or not.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great news for constructors, because ultimately they're getting the Airfix model with the instructions and all the bits that come in, right? So it's, for constructors, it's a great thing. For designers, it's a great thing. But I think for developers who are overseeing all of it, it's probably not great news, actually. I mean, there's a great deal of certainty in the assurance they're going to get from the product at the end of it, of course. But I don't see the design process we may be able to make shorter. I think the construction process will become more efficient, and construction is generally very bad at efficiency and productivity. I think we're the worst industry actually for improving year on year around that. But I think when you look at the overall programme is going to get much, much longer. I mean, I saw an infographic the other week. Great infographic. I didn't know what an infographic was either. but the infographic demonstrated 15 months extra on a normal building. It was for a very particular sort of organisation, but it was high-rise residential construction based on their normal programme, plus the kind of no overlap between stage 4 and stage 5. So stage 4 is finished, then there's the process in between, then we're building it, and that was with no going back and waiting and stopping during, so no changes. Then the process at the end to sign it off, to the point that they got their first apartment ready was 15 months longer. Their design process was much smaller, their construction process was a lot smaller, but the fact those stage 4 and stage 5 didn't overlap at all pushed the program out like 12, 14, 15 months. And I think that's the developer's problem. Construction, not a problem. Design, not a problem. If you're owning it, that could be obviously a massive problem. And all the cost is front end.
Yeah. And is it, Tim, I'll come to you, do you see a solution to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think without being negative, I think programs will extend. I think you're going to see more. You're going to see longer PCSA, or pre-construction periods, whilst we do the right thing and we get the design. Because obviously some of that work is currently done while you're on site. So that's got to be done up front, and that's the right thing to do. My big fear in a lot of all of this is the capacity of the regulator to approve the stuff. You're only as good as your weakest link, and I don't mean that in a nasty way, but we could get all this information handed over, and it just sit there if there isn't the resource at the other end to be able to assess it. What happens then? Do we just see sites all around the country grind to a halt? There's a risk there with that. I think the way, ultimately what you need to do is you need to circumvent some of those issues, don't you? So what you need to do is to use tried and tested products time and time again. And that ultimately leads towards a more manufacturing approach, where you've got catalogues and libraries of products that you feel comfortable with that are tested in the scenarios in which they're going to be used, that you then do assemble a kit of parts, similar to a manufacturing approach, which is something I've espoused for many a year, and we're not quite there yet. So I think there's opportunity with that as well as risk.
Yeah, and that also puts an onus on product manufacturers as well to make sure that scenarios are tested in. Again, I'll take a little bit out of my talk a bit later, but it's tested in scenarios that are actually going to be used.
Exactly.
Because the amount that aren't at the moment can be concerning. And is that what we were just talking about? Is that your concern with Gateway 3 as well? That could just grind to a halt on site, but you're effectively still not completed and they're not occupied either.
It's a risk.
Yeah,
it's a risk.
That's good. Douglas, I don't know if you had any comment in particular. I know you're on a number of working groups and so on, especially around competency as well. How you see that affecting, or is there other legislation you know of coming out and so on?
Yeah, well, part of the work that I do is I'm on the competence steering group, and I co-chair working group 12, which was for competency in construction products, and that's really what we're looking at. In that is that it's not enough now to say that you're competent. There has to be the demonstration of competency that's there. That's fundamental to it all. And a lot of the work that has gone on within the competence steering group and all the working groups that are off that, from designers to construction products to engineers to installers, are all looking at finding ways of being able to allow people to demonstrate their competency, particularly in competence frameworks. So really coming out of the Building Safety Act and this sort of drive for increased competency, there's talk that there will be secondary legislation which will encompass competence in more detail, and that in itself would be music to our ears. We've seen more and more in the competence arena, particularly from the standards that have been written by BSA. So there's the starting almost with the jigsaw box, how to put together your competence framework at your 8670 level, your Flex 8670, which is actually this year going to become a full British standard. So we've actually put together a standard, 4 standards, to show how frameworks can be made. And then there were the 3 mandated standards of that: principal designer, principal contractor, and those involved in building safety management. So, but in addition to that, as I say, industry has really got its act together in terms of looking at how can people demonstrate their competence. The best way of doing that is through competence frameworks. And we're starting to see more and more across the different sectors, including Working Group 7. I also work Working Group 7 with designers, because the one thing that we would say about being a designer, and this is from a specifier's point of view, is that we're also designers. We're also designers even under CDM. So, and a lot of people don't realise that as soon as you put pen to paper on a bill of quantities or putting a specification together, you're actually taking that risk, you're taking that step forward as a designer too. So it's a real onus now on the people who are involved in that specification, even in that spec breaking, as much as the spec making, for them to realise that no, they're actually a designer and they will need to be able to demonstrate their competency as much as anybody else.
Yeah, I think you partly answered my next question was, how would a company demonstrate that? that confidence when you refer to a framework? Is that going to be, would it be audited a bit like an ISO, for instance?
Well, at the moment, there's a lot of people who are working, excuse me, on putting their frameworks together. So, for example, in our industry, in the ironmongery industry, we have put together a separate working party to create competency frameworks for our industry, right down to including manufacturing, although with manufacturing you do have the ISOs, you have the 9001s, etc. But in order for people to have that ability to say, for a particular function, for example, specifying or coordinating a project, that within the function that they're doing, to be able to demonstrate that competency, and that competency broken up into the skills, the knowledge, the experience, the behaviour, the 4 elements that are put out there. So yeah, I think at the moment it's very much work in progress. We have found with our own industry, having created our own working group, that even though I've been greatly involved in working group 12, and even though I've been in the competency steering group, it's actually hard. It's difficult, because if you consider all the different functions across the whole construction industry, how on earth are you going to be able to provide a platform for people to demonstrate that? So there's a lot of people who are working very hard in the background in their own industries, and what we've done in working group 12 is we've created a peer support group. It's almost an Alcoholics Anonymous for those involved in competency, but we've created a peer support group where people can come and say, look, this is what we're doing, this is what we're working on, this is how we're looking to demonstrate competency in ironmongery and fire doors, and there'll be other people in passive fire protection, and there'll be other people in other areas. So the work is ongoing, but it ain't easy.
Yeah, no, that's good. We're nearly at time. What I wanted to just throw it out there quickly, just for, I think we've got time for one question, if anyone's got any particular for our panelists.
Okay. Yeah, as a fire engineer, I just wanted to comment on the 2 staircases issue, and really reiterate what Tom was saying, is that it seems as if the requirements are coming, which I think we can't deny is political, it's from the court of common sense, whether we like that or not. But the point of the matter is we've got that requirement, and yet there doesn't seem to be a proper articulation anywhere of how they can be used. So, for example, the comment I was second referring to escape, I would suggest that's probably not the case, but we haven't got the NFCC really stating, well, operationally, this is how it's going to be used, so therefore designers can articulate that and use that concept. Because as you're saying, quite rightly, you can design an extremely dangerous 2-staircase building. This is one of the problems we've got, where you've got the court of common sense leading the design factor. And then even within that, the bit I find interesting is that they still haven't addressed the issue of accessible means of escape, which ties in with 2 staircases. So there's lots of work to be done. And the final point with that then says about the single staircase. I believe you can design a safe single staircase building, but I do believe we need to reassess how we do that.
I'm tempted to be Speaker of Parliament and say, is there a question? But that's a really good point. Thank you. I've got time for one more. Yeah, go for it. Just grab the light for me.
My question's about CDP. So, are we going to, and with Gateway 2, so are we going to bring CDP in earlier to design before Gateway 2? And is that going to lead to additional cost? Or are we going to look to architectural practices to do more? And are they geared up to do that as well?
So, actually going towards my presentation, which I'm going to talk about later, I think that as architects we will be doing more, but I do think we will need contractors to come in earlier and inform the design process and work towards more CDP. So I think it will be, but it needs to be done before the Gateway 2.
Yeah, so then I suppose, Tim, then, from our point of view, bringing contractors in earlier, we need to procure them as well. How do you see that working from a programme point of view?
I don't see that there's necessarily an encumbrance from a programme point of view, and from a financial point of view, it's more of a cash flow issue, isn't it? You're more front-loading your cash flow, which ultimately will mean, I'm not a developer, but will ultimately mean more exposure of risk to planning, won't it, up front? So I think it's a reprofiling of the cost base for a project, but then consequently you're then saving money, in theory, later on. So I think it's going to depend on, well, you re-engineer the process, so people are going to have to get more used to an increased appetite for risk at the front end of projects. Yeah, I think one of the things that I'd add into that is that in if you're an integrated developer constructor, it's actually, I think in theory it's easy, but I suppose some of the question I have is at what point do you actually engage and procure the people that are going to build your building? And inherently it's those that bring in contractors. So actually you're in a position where you've got to design and have contractors doing the design when you don't actually have a constructor yet. So how does that work? I mean, the answer is I don't know. Just hoping I get employed still, early engagement. Earlier the better with passive fire protection, always remember that. But I mean, I think that these are some of the teething problems that will come out. But I mean, we've had presentations at work where the title was CDP is dead, and you sort of think, well, that seems a little bit extreme because specialist contractors have still got to do design. But you sort of think, but when and how are they going to be procured and engaged and in what terms? You're going to bring someone in early to do the CDP and then re-procure who's going to deliver it. I mean, that can happen, and the best thing to do is to get the early engagement done by the people who are going to do the constructing, right? So I think again, it's just a little bit of a suck it and see situation, but hopefully it will come out in the wash.
Just to add one extra thing, I think as a final point, all of this is predicated by the fact that we build a prototype every single project that we do, and then we never use it again, do we? We go and build another prototype. If we think like manufacturers, and ultimately if we can design from standard sub-assemblies, components, NMC items, and we've done the testing once, pay for it once, use it often. That's where the benefit really is. It doesn't have to be at a macro level in a building, but if you can get standard interfaces and elements that and you use them time and time again, there's no reason why that cost needs to be incurred up front, because you've got a tried and tested solution that you can just deploy and roll out time and time again.
I suppose with the clients have to be on board with that as well. The drive's got to be there for the developers to want to reuse the same product.
Absolutely, and you'd hope that if you were a customer, that it's in your interest to pursue that kind of line as well.
Excellent. Tim, Douglas, Tom, Nias, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry, and panellists. We've got one final speech, presentation before we break for refreshments. So I'll introduce to you Paul McSholly from Mace, an extremely knowledgeable individual who has the ability to present detail on process. What I love about Paul is his ability to be able to bring high-level Building Safety Act concepts down to the granular day-to-day operational process of specifying, designing and procuring correctly.
I hope so.
Putting
it out there,
really. So yeah, Paul from Mace, and he's going to be joined by Douglas also.
I'll be good. You can't be well, Douglas, I think we're going to do a bit of playing with this as well. Do this originally, I said, do you know what, if Douglas can do this as well, it's going to work really well, because I think I do a lot of stuff around certain products, which is smoke control. I think we're talking about 2 staircases. I think Tom's point is so valid. Put 2 stairs in, how are you going to smoke control the pair of them? Is one going to then cause a problem with the other? It's all that thought process that hasn't gone into it. I think it's the point you're making there yourself. It's not just the stair, it's everything else that goes with it. So I've stolen Doug's time and gone, when is a fire stopping not a fire stopping? Because as everyone knows, who knows me, I don't like the word fire stopping, and I'll explain why in a second. So we used a quote first of all from Construction News the other day. I think it's Hull Davis that said this, and he said the changes are not being done to change the standards we work to, it's about how we behave. And he says in there as well, the industry has an opportunity to demonstrate a willingness to embrace these reforms and regain the public trust. And I think the point of the staircase that was made by Scott Brownrigg earlier, Alicia, is that the trust is gone in single staircase buildings. Is it going to be in the EWS01 form again? Who knows? You can see it coming, all of this, right? So it will not be easy, quick, but it needs to be done. And I think the mechanism of how you do it is going to be the hard bit, because I think it's so complex, some of these standards. When you try and bring them to a smaller level, it's still complex. It's really hard to get it to a way where even designers can process it, let alone us as construction or the supply chain. Because one of the things I think exists is that we say the product manufacturers, it was said earlier, maybe need to test to the scenario, but actually we've got scenarios which are impossible to test to, if that makes sense. If we keep treating it, the manufacturers have got to do more, just give them £10 billion and they'll get there. It's expensive stuff to test. So what I'm going to do really quickly, just to say to everyone, is that all these standards on the left, apart from one at the top is about how you set a furnace up, all have different requirements. A fire duct carries air, a damper blocks a path of air on the wall. So a damper would be VE on the wall as a classification of fire ducts horizontal. That's all you need to know really, it's not the same hooch. Penetration seals covers pipes, buzz bars, covers electrical cabling. It's about 7 standards in one. You've got linear gap joints, service duct, which is all your critical systems through a building. And we call it fire stuffing. It's mental, isn't it? It's crazy. We shouldn't be doing it. It's wrong. We're branding it as one thing, fire stop, but it's like a Stanley knife, isn't it? When do you want a carpet cut or a wall board? Civil games, we've got to define it by what it is, because if we keep treating it so frivolous, we won't actually know what's within it. We'll make the mistake of misspecifying. It's very easy to be done. You can have things like left-handing doors. I'll probably have to rip this out and carry it around me, don't I? Oh, look at this. See? Yeah, absolutely. Showing me up already. So the big thing is, well, just because something's been tested and CE marked doesn't mean you can put it where you want. Everything's got an appropriate place to put it. And that's where this comes in. I don't think you can read the clarity on it, but my biggest thing in life has always been about Regulation 7. Adequate and proper materials, appropriately fixed for the circumstances, adequately mixed and prepared, applied fixed used adequate for the function for which it was designed. Fancy that, eh? And you install it in a workmanlike manner. And the thing is, when you look at the Building Safety Act, it talks about this as well in the same language. And what it refers you to is a list in CPR of all the safety critical products. And I think there's 35 groupings of which one is fire. I think the point was made earlier by you, Alicia, as well. What about the other 33? What about your water regulations? What about your structural safety? It all comes into that same Building Safety Act. It's all at me about appropriate materials. So, moving on really simply. One smoke control damper and one wall. That's what you've got to do. So, we're expecting architects to work that out with building services engineers. You're not going to do it, are you? It's just to show you how complex it is. And that took about 4 or 5 of us, a lot of peer reviewing to go, do you know what, that is it? Some of that's about the wall, some of that's about the classification of the kit. Is it manual? Is it automatic? What pressure do you want? Who knows? But you can simplify it. Right? You're going to go, shit, that ain't simplified, is it? What we tried to do, and I don't think there's a laser thing on this, there might be, but anyway, we try to put it into 5 group categories to say that everything's around shape and form of building and building risk, because you can put a storeroom in a hospital and put it in an office building, you'll have 2 different classifications. One might be EIS with a W for the door, office might be E, but it all depends on the product and how you classify it. How it operates, because it actually comes into it. Some things are dynamic, take smoke away, and some things, unfortunately, are static, like a door, but it's transit, you can walk through it. Then you can look at actually how you classify it, how it fits in the wall, because all of these products have different requirements and different walls, but you still got to be able to install it. So we try to break it down a bit simpler. So when you look at what's going on with all the gateways, we're talking about Gateway 1, Gateway 2, Gateway 3. If you get to Gateway 2, but you've never considered how you classify and put these products in the building as a system, I think Tim said it earlier about getting to like a readiness level with it, kit of parts, you don't know these are going to fit at Gateway 2, do you? So this is the bit of work that's got to go on. This is why I've actually got to go through kit properly, classify it. Classify it for what it is. Don't use the word fire stopping. It's a fire damper, for which the 7 frame types, one involves back. I'm not being funny, but if I see a guy on site with a trail of plaster putting around a damper, I'd have to take a picture, because it'd be amazing. Especially from a fire stopping company, because it's not really their trade, is it? Which is where the competency part, all this comes into it. Once you know that, guess what? You can actually QA onto site. So that's the big version of it. Not going to bore you to death with it, but essentially is, if you look at the 5 points how you get there, building type, space risk, how it operates, classification, substrate, install it, that is a culmination of all of those products in that wall, not just the one you're looking at. And that's the system approach, which is really hard as well, because when we say about CDP, as mentioned earlier, you've got to know what all that kit is and what all it wants early on to get the wall type right. Otherwise, people just go and put shaft wall everywhere. I'm going to use white wall. Yeah, you just got to make the product work for the substrate. Not going to happen, is it? That gives you a bigger picture of it all. All these things have got their own product standards. Doug's going to talk about doors, but the wall itself as well still got its own requirements for testing. You've still got to be safe enough to put all of these things in. You can't make it like a Swiss cheese, can you? It'll just fall down. So that's for dampers. This is complicated as smoke control, and you can make it simpler. And what we've done is put it into kit of parts.
So we're trying to give everyone a mechanism where you can actually look at it and go, you can cherry pick scenarios, whether it's got evacuation risks, whether it's got sleeping risks, and you can actually start looking at classification of this equipment in a very methodical way. So at the end of it, you know how it's installed and a bit about space. You talk about staircases, some of this stuff here needs 400 or 500 mil of space to install it. And at the moment, when we talk about the VE because the staircases has got in, let's make the risers smaller. And you've got to record this stuff digitally from both sides, get in there. And I put it to you, like, Tom, you haven't got guys that are this big that can go in there and do it. So these guys need early engagement as well, because they can say to you, you know what, I need 400 mil of space behind this to install it. Unless you now know what the product is, I can tell you how to put it in. That's half the battle. So we need these kind of playbooks to help people get it right. We also need what's called like a passive fire code to get it to that point as well. Because at the moment, no one actually knows what information's got to come to what party, if that makes sense. Which is half of the architectural community, because they're going, well, this person's selecting dampers, this one's doing doors, this one's doing smoke control, I'm doing the walls, but I don't know what the input is to verify that wall. So we need that bit of like collaboration to get moving. So we've done it for a few different things, and pipework, if you look over here on this one here, you've got a classification number there for a damper. Look at pipework, different number. Someone's got to get to that number for each pipe, for each tray, for each damper, each smoke control duct. Look at that one, even bigger. Still make it simpler, but again, you've got to have a process that reflects that into a simpler way you can workbook it. Does that make sense? There's a lot of collaboration going on. There's lots of really good people that help with Active Plan. You've got George Stevenson, you've got the ASFP, CLM, other people that are helping us get to this kind of level of granularity. So we want to try and get this done for all products, so actually know what these classification numbers are. And once you've got that, you can actually go to a manufacturer and pick a component. Then you can look at how it fits, and you can get to this magical world of standard kit of parts. Because at the moment, I think you said yourself too, we design every job from fresh, don't we? And that's basically, everyone's talking about golden thread like it's a digital record. If you haven't got that bit, are you recording something that's installed wrong? That's the thing, isn't it? Are you going to self-incriminate because you actually don't know why it was there in the first place? That's the big thing. Why is it there? So you need like a kind of whole process to get there where you can go, you've got a passive code, you've got a way of workbooking it, because this will give you your golden thread for product selection, how you get there. Then you can start talking about builder's work at the end, because a lot of the time we talk about builder's work and you go, what you put in the out? I don't know. I value engineered it. What is it? I don't know. It's cheaper. I think just one last thing before I hand over to Doug is that Neil's point about, some of this stuff as well about the regulating resistance to fire. It's about, they're talking about reaction to fire. This is all about resistance to fire as well. If you change resistance to fire from something to something less, that's going to be a problem as well. That says reaction to fire, because these words aren't kind of determined. But also think of it this way as well, is that if you're changing it to a higher product, because you've got it wrong in the first place, that's going to be harder to explain, isn't it? Does that make sense? And now I'm going to hand over to Douglas.
You kind of stole my joke, because, when is a fire stopper not a fire stopper? Because, of course, it is actually, the joke is when is a door not a door? Well, when the door is a jar, thank you. So it is when the door is ajar. So I suppose the question, though, is not when is a door not a door. When is a door not just a door is probably the better question to ask, because like the title of the film, when it comes to doors, when it comes to ironmongery, it's complicated. Now, I don't have as many busy diagrams as Paul here, but yes, it is complicated as well. And really what I wanted to do was unpack some of those complications, just to give an indication. So, for example, when's a door not a door? When it's a fire door, and we'll be talking more about that throughout this. When it's a non-fire door, because you can get applications where it isn't. Maybe there's acoustics on it. Security, it might need tested to PAS 24. You might need to automate it. If you do, then you're going to need to ensure that it's installed to the correct standard at EN 16005. Access control. What kind of access control do you need on it? Emergency escape and panic escape. There are differences. You will need to use different forms of hardware in each different circumstance. So when is a door not just a door? A door has all of these different potential uses in a building. And it's not just about the door. If we take a fire door, for example, it's not just about that bit of wood that swings on a hinge. It's actually about everything that's in behind it. So, and things that people don't necessarily even see or think of. So you've got your supporting structure, your packing zone at the back of the frame. What about your frame design? Then you start to get into the components of the actual leaf itself. Your ironmongery has a division panel, acoustic performance, seals, the likes of intumescent seals, are they correctly specified? Smoke control. All of these are important constituent parts of a fire door. So what makes it a fire door as opposed to just a big block of wood that's hanging in the space? It really comes down to the fire test evidence, because that's what's going to make it into a fire door. So for a fire door, it has to prove that it has been through the correct test. So European standards, EN 1634 parts 1 to 3. British standards, BS 476 parts 20 to 22. And then when you get to the ironmongery product, to be used on a fire door, you should have the valid fire test evidence that it has been tested on a similar fire door. It's not just a matter of putting any ironmongery on any fire door. Now at the moment, testing for both the EN 1634 and the 476 standards are currently acceptable for fire door testing under approved document B. That was out for consultation earlier on in the year. God help us all if it goes through to take it away, but maybe that's a personal view on BS 47622 for fire doors, because that'll have a massive implication on the fire door and the ironmongery industry. Not quite as complicated as Paul's, but whenever you take a look at an FD30 or an FD30S, where did that come from? Well, that FD30 and FD30S, those are the ratings that you'll find coming from your BS 476 testing. It might be an E30 door or an E30SA, and those come from the EN 1634. So you can get different ratings of fire doors depending on the fire test that it has gone through. So what else? When is it not just a fire door? Well, when it has many configurations of being a fire door. So you can get a full height single door, full height double door with unequal leaf, penny farthing some people call it, full height double door equal leaves, full height single door with an over panel, full height door and unequal leaf and an over panel as well, right through to, is it a single swing, is it a double swing? All of these potential configurations just for the one door. Like I said at the start, it's complicated. And then when it gets into the stuff that my members are really into, the Guild of Architectural Ironmongers, when it needs ironmongery. The one thing about ironmongery is, particularly when it comes to the specification of it, is you don't realise that it's there until it's actually not very good. And then you realise that it's not very good. So if the ironmongery specifier does their job right, if the installer does their job right, you will use ironmongery. You wouldn't even have noticed that you had that pull handle going through the door there. If it's loose, you will. One thing that has been said about pull handles or about handles in general is they say that they are the handshake of the building. That's actually a quote that somebody, and I didn't just make that up, but when you think about it, it's the first thing that you touch in a building. So it's really important because first impressions do last. So a few examples, and again, if you just look around any building, you'll see all various different ways of having the ironmongery specified. The pull handle and push plate you would have seen coming in. It could be a hold open device in a corridor, electromagnetically held open. Your lever handle, your locks with your cylinder and turn. Access control I talked about. Is it magnetic locking? What kind of locking is it? All of those sorts of things. Escape or panic hardware. The specifier is the person who needs to know what they're doing in order to get it right, as well as getting into the seals for both acoustic and intumescent. So how to specify the ironmongery? Most people don't realise this. It can take up to 3 years to learn to do it properly. And that's actually true. And in fact, when I did it about 20 years ago, it was a 4-year course. So we in the GAI, the Guild of Architectural Ironmongers, have a diploma course where we teach people how to specify this stuff properly. And we have a methodology of doing it where you hang the door, you close it, you lock it, you operate it, you protect it with your signs, you protect it with your kicking plates, you'll label it with the correct signage, you'll seal it, acoustic, weather, intumescent, and then any other extras that are involved on the project. There is a whole process involved in specification of ironmongery that most people don't even realise. In order to do that, though, we need the correct information. And getting back to what was talked about earlier, it's about getting it right at the very, very start. and not having to just take a guess. So it's ensuring that in addition to the numbered floor plans that you'll receive, that you'll have the right door schedule with the correct fire ratings, thicknesses of doors, dimensions. These are all critical details to ensure that you get your ironmongery right. The joinery head and jamb details. Details on if it needs held open, if it needs access controlled, if it needs that powered operator. All of these things need to be considered in the specification. And then the correct standards. Ironmongery in itself is filled full of standards. It's what we live, eat and breathe. But there's an awful lot of the standards that we have are harmonised or now designated. So I talked about hanging it, closing it, locking it. Some of these are key critical, what we call essential ironmongery. So if it's going to be ironmongery on a fire door, for your hinge it needs to be CE or in the future UKCA marked to EN 1935. For your door closer it's 1154. For your electromagnetic it's 1155. For your door coordinator it's 1158, etc., etc. Each individual component has its own standard, needs to be tested and should be CE marked. And then when it's properly specified by the experts, as I mentioned earlier, there's a push more and more now towards competency to ensure that your product is properly specified, to ensure that your product is properly installed. What we do in our trade association is we have a number of different qualifications that can take 3 years, plus lifelong learning beyond that as registered professionals, where you will have to have your CPD points, rather like REBA. I bet you never even thought you would be hearing any of this about ironmongery and fire doors when you come in, but it just shows there's granular detail in each building. We reckon that ironmongery is worth 1.5 to 2% of the value of the entire building. But if it's done wrong, it has a huge impact on the performance of the building itself. So when is a door not just a door? Well, when it's actually a lifesaver, because that's a real life situation there. So that is two sides of the same door. So on that side there was the fire. Non-fire on the left-hand side. The fire door did its job. It preserved the compartmentation. It meant the fire did not spread throughout the building. So when is a door not just a door? When it is a lifesaver. So a closing thought here, not just from myself, but also from Paul, because anything in relation to these kinds of products, whether it be fire doors, whether they be dampers, whether they be smoke control products, they're all highly engineered part of a building's passive fire protection system. So always ensure they're correctly specified, designed, installed, maintained, inspected throughout their life cycle. Because if you look after them, when you're using the building, they'll look after you, and if you're in doubt, just ask the experts.
And it's interesting, Douglas, because I went through the ones at the beginning pretty quick because I know we're strapped for time here. But when you look at those big ontology diagrams and you look at a door, you could apply that to that. You'll get the same result. And I think for all of us, I think it's how we make it simpler to digest it, because it's so complex, all of this stuff. And I didn't start off with those diagrams to get to that point where I was like, wow, no one's ever going to get this right. How do you specify it? How do you specify a fire damper at the moment? CDP by contractor, when it all relies on knowing the risk of the space to classify it correctly. But if you're a fire engineer, no disrespect, do they know the risk of the space if we don't know what the space is because the developer hasn't told the architect to pass it on to them? So we talked about change earlier, is that the big thing of all of this is that having a way of doing golden thread, in my view is pretty simple, is that there's only two golden threads. There's actually how you get to the product in relation to the space, how it all works as a system, then it's just about patching serial numbers. You can't put that kind of golden thread in BIM at the moment, as far as I can see, because there's no way of recording it. You have to go to an external schedule, if that makes sense.
So I just wanted to kick off to start with three somewhat starting statistics. You haven't heard them before, but I think it really brings into the relevance of what I'm about to speak about. The first one is that 17% of dry lining is rework. That's a huge amount of money and time wasted, and that can be anything from if it's going in too early and getting wet to error in design. The second one is that a number of you may be aware of the Getting It Right initiative, and one of their statistics is that between 10 and 25 billion pounds can be saved annually by eliminating that error. So again, it starts bringing some actual figures to it. And then just lastly, from what we see, bring it down to a very granular level, up to around 50% of specifications we get through the door are not fully compliant. So it's that's not to scare anyone or anything, but I think it brings into relevance what I'm about to talk about now, is that this early collaboration piece, which I think is starting to become a real thread through the day, is so important. So what I wanted to talk about was recommendations for manufacturers. Now, I know most of the audience here are designers, specifiers, contractors, but there's a really important role for us to play here as product manufacturers, because we're a key part of that collaboration and engagement early doors. Excuse the pun. So the three listed here, as you can see, and they're really designed to bring about clarity and simplicity in the design and specification process. So if we go into them in a little bit more detail, if we look at recommendation A, it's all about the specifier and the specification. So the specification, as has been mentioned previously, it needs to be detailed. It can't just be a performance specification now. It needs to be detailed in terms of product, and the products need to be designed as systems. So how they work and interact together, which I'll go through in a bit more detail shortly. But that also brings design workshops and reviews into play a lot more, because you need to be backed up by the manufacturer. It's all very well us saying, well, you've got to do the specification right, but we need to be there to support you, because as was mentioned previously, I feel especially sorry for architects, but with the amount of information you will have to try and take in with all the different products on the building. That's probably slightly biased towards architects, but contractors I'm sure are the same as well. So manufacturers really are here to support you and back you up. So as in CELA, we actually offer that one-to-one workshop now to help that specification. So be free to get in touch. Her very own Keelan is standing at the side to help you. But to give you an example, if you've got a 30-minute fire door and you're putting it into a wall, that wall has to be tested with that door for them to create that fire barrier. So if you're putting a 30-minute fire door, for argument's sake, into a polystyrene wall, the door may last 30 minutes, but if the wall fails, they fail together. So if the door fails, the wall fails, the wall fails, the door fails. They fail or pass as a system. So it's really important that they're designed and used together as systems, as tested. So that really takes us on to recommendation B. And this is where the CCPI comes in, the Code of Construction Products Information. It's not been mentioned too much yet, but this is really for us to make sure that all of the information we put out there, whether it be in our brochures, our websites, our data sheets, what we give you from NBS, is correct and accurate, but also simple enough to understand. Because, as we've had earlier from Paul, it can be very complex. All the different documentation can create a lot of complexity. What's really important with our products is that we confirm what they can be used in, or how they can be used, but just as importantly, how they cannot be used. Because it's all very well saying, yeah, 30-minute fire door can be used in a 30-minute wall, that's great, but that doesn't tell you what wall that is. And that can give, as an example, take a riser door in shaft wall. And shaft wall is not, that's a very common scenario, but shaft wall itself is not classed as flexible standard supporting construction. So it's not like, and that's very specific in the standard. So to use that as an example, you need to know from the manufacturer, has that door been tested in that specific wall system that you're looking to use? So again, recommendation C is, I always look at it as a bit of a carry on from recommendation B, but it's because it's around creating that clarity of information, clear communication, and what's been tested and in what system. I use this expression not bafflingly with science, because take a scenario where you've got a manufacturer with a sales team and a technical team. They don't necessarily interact, being slightly different personality types, but if they don't, the sales team may have a load of documentation, certification for a product, and the architect phones up, I need certification for this product I'm looking to use on this project. Yep, no problem at all. So we send you a zip file full of 30 different documents, all related to that product. Now, the high likelihood is that you need probably not only just one of those 30 documents, but one small section of that one document within those 30 documents. So it's really important that we can direct you to the correct area within the certification, so you can have that high level of confidence when you're specifying and designing, that when you put a system of products together, they can perform as required or better. So if we look at the ways products can be from fire, this is specifically in relation to fire, but how the information can be presented and used. We look at 3 different types of assessment, and one of those was referred to earlier, which we'll go on to. Field application reports is now the one to look at. So a lot of you would be familiar with global assessments, which is more relevant to the BS 476 certification, but for the EN 1634 standard, which we always test to now, field application reports, it's rules based, and it brings into account all of the different testing you've done on a product. So we'll often get asked by someone, can we have a test certificate for that product? We need just a test report and we just need a certificate. That basically tells you nothing, especially if it's just a single test report. There could be something within that test that actually failed, a single element, but if you look at the field of application, it gives you the detail in which all the different tests that have been carried out, how it can be used, how it can't be used, and how you should be designing it. However, we all know that there are project specific details and site restrictions that we always come across, and that may be in that scenario where we need to do a project specific assessment. But just to be really clear, a project specific assessment is still based on primary test evidence. So to give you an example, using our riser doors again, if a contractor wanted to use a particular intumescent mastic which we hadn't tested with, what they would look at is, okay, let's look at the primary test evidence for this intumescent mastic. Has it been used with a metal frame between the metal frame and the blockwork that you've got this exact scenario on site for? If it has, then they can take that as well as our test evidence where our door's been tested with an intumescent mastic in blockwork and tie them together using fire engineering principles. So as you can see, that's still based on primary test evidence. What we really want to avoid is the desktop or engineering assessment. I think Tim mentioned, I can't see him now, Tim mentioned earlier. And this question, are they dead? I really think they should be. They are extremely rare now because notified bodies are not keen on them in the slightest. And the main reason for this is because they're opinions based, and they're purely done from fire engineering principles, not primary test evidence. So you can imagine, so take the scenario I just gave you, the riser door intumescent mastic. They may look at an intumescent mastic, and that was tested between a linear joint between 2 blockwork walls, and then they tie them together because our system has been tested in blockwork. But you can see that can start getting extremely risky looking at different products, because doors and walls have to be used as a system, and it's all about the interaction between the door and the wall. So if there's an element of that intumescent mastic which doesn't really work with a metal frame because of the deflection or something, you've then got a big problem. So that's why desktop assessments they're very rare, but they should probably be dead. But the reason being is because if we can engage at a much earlier point in the project, these second 2 shouldn't really be a need at all. Or project specific assessments, there always is going to be, I think, a requirement for them. There's always going to be bits here and there that haven't been foreseen. But if we can get the design right early, then we can avoid them as much as possible. There are further recommendations covering periodic retesting. So in relation to products, they recommend testing at least every 3 years. They go through testing methods and using independent bodies for this for third-party certification. So it's not just we test a product and 20 years later we're still supplying what we think is the same thing. Materials are bound to have changed, and the system in which it was used is bound to have been updated in the previous years. So it's really important to keep up that testing. It's not cheap by any stretch of the imagination, but it has to be done to prove that constancy of performance. So again, that then can go into the golden thread of information. By proving that constancy of performance, we can give you that accurate information that we can be confident it will perform time and time again in the same manner used in the systems that it was tested within. So a couple of considerations, especially I guess this is related to contractors, but for everyone, and I know we've discussed VE previously, but just specifically in relation to manufacturers and product testing. If there's if a price seems too good to be true, it really most likely is. It's there is a minimum threshold cost to making a product compliant. So if there's an inordinately cheaper price, there has to be a reason for it. Often materials may overlap between different products, but it's really important to read and understand that certification. We'll come back to these recommendations I was talking about earlier. Understanding how they were tested, in what systems. So it's definitely something to keep consideration of. And if we look at value engineering, this is part of the Building Safer Future document, but there's the National Market Surveillance coming on board for the product substitution. But if we look at take these two pictures as an example in relation to certification, the front cover or the test certificate, as we sometimes get asked for, will say, I want a stair balancers with a horse at the bottom, or that's what the front cover says. The field of application will tell you the type of wood to use, how it's finished, the density of wood, the exact position on the stair, and everything within that photo you can see to allow you to get that design and specification right in the first place. So I know it's a slightly extreme example, but hopefully that kind of describes to you the reason why you should look at the whole certification rather than just looking at a front cover or a test certificate itself. Finally, just my final note on that is that you should really be backed up by manufacturers. We should be able to help you understand the certification at any given point. The earlier the better. We always recommend certainly a consideration of fire doors and walls as systems at REBA stage 2. Now I know that may sound very early, but what that does is, to give you an example, take riser layouts. Now within the EN testing standard, there's certain nib sizes which are required, and if the riser layouts are not looked at carefully, to achieve the right nib sizes, you start restricting access because the doors are going to have to get smaller or shift around. So that's just one example of why that early collaboration is really key. And my last point is that if you're speaking to a manufacturer, they can't give you the correct information or the where to look or help you understand it properly, you are talking to the wrong manufacturer. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Very helpful. I'm not sure how many manufacturers are in the room, but from those that specify manufacturers' products, maybe gives you an overview as to what goes into bringing a product to market. It isn't just something that's in a box. A lot of work, investment and testing, certification's gone into it. It's important to buy the right product for the right situation. So moving on, I'd like to invite now from Scott Brownrigg back to the stage, and she's going to give us more of an architect's perspective on the Building Safety Act. She's already touched on a few points already. I'm really interested to hear what she's got to say.
Thank you. So, welcome and thank you for your time today. So, as Lewis mentioned, I'm going to give you sort of a viewpoint from an architect's perspective. So obviously we know that the Building Safety Act is having a massive impact on the profession as a whole. There's a lot of contradicting and confusing information out there, so it's our job to try and sort of navigate through that and come up with a suitable solution. So I'm an architect, so I'm going to put some pretty pictures in between the slides of text. So I have been working for Scott Brownrigg now for 12 years and specialised in residential and mixed use, and as I mentioned earlier, internationally and in the UK. So I've got a sort of an interesting perspective on health and safety abroad versus health and safety here. And you know, we do technically do health and safety better here, but the two staircase thing is an interesting one that they've abroad always done. So I am going to repeat some of the the slides that Neil Bradley mentioned earlier, but I don't think that's a bad thing, as it shows that I was actually listening when you came to our practice and presented to us. So the Building Safety Act and secondary legislation. So as Neil mentioned, it is for residential buildings that are 18 metres or 7 storeys. Also, any building over that height limit that has 2 residential units, so you can have a big office building that's just got 2 residential units, and the Act will apply to that. And then also, as Neil mentioned, hospitals and care homes, but only during construction, not during occupation. So that's quite an important thing. So Part 4 of the Act brings into account the accountable person, which actually puts pressure and regulations on the tenants and the people owning the buildings. So they are exempt from Part 4 of the Act, but they do need to comply with the Building Safety Act for the first construction. So I'm going to talk through the gateways. I'm going to leave out Gateway 3, but more focus on Gateway 1 and 2 and the impacts that that's having from an architect's workflow point of view. So Gateway 1, as I mentioned earlier, is enacted under the planning legislation. So the Building Safety Regulator is not interested in Gateway 1 at all. They're only interested in Gateway 2 and 3. But as part of Gateway 1, we must present a fire statement with our full planning application. So this is putting a lot of pressure on fire engineers, and we're finding they're getting very busy. But it is something that actually we would have done anyway. So as a designer of residential buildings, fire safety is sort of imperative to the design. So we've always done that, but now it's something that we must do in a specific format. There is a question whether planning policy is actually the appropriate place to address fire safety, because obviously who is actually assessing these fire statements when they're going for planning? Who are the professional bodies looking at it? However, it is obviously imperative to get it right at this stage, so that at the next stage it complies with the building regulations. Gateway 2. So as we've spoken quite a lot about this today, Gateway 2 is the submission of the drawings to prove compliance with the regulations that need to go to the Building Safety Regulator for the 12-week review period. But as we did sort of allude to earlier, is it going to be 12 weeks? If we look at the planning system, which should be 12 weeks to go through the planning applications, it's never 12 weeks now. So is that going to have an impact on the building safety regulators as well? And from an architect's perspective, I sort of alluded to it earlier, but for us, design is an iterative process, and it's best delivered sequentially, as when we design one package, it interfaces and informs on the next package. But now we have to, for the Gateway 2 submission, make the submission as a complete pack. So this is where we need to understand all the design elements, and this goes back to what Paul and Douglas were saying about understanding the systems. We need to, as architects, understand them really early on to make sure that we can submit a complete pack of information for Gateway 2. So it really is about collaboration between all the different parts and early collaboration. So, I mean, this is sort of reiterating it. So for some packages to be complete, we need to some specialist input and manufacturers, select assistants, we need all of that. So we need to discuss this at RIBA stage 3 so that we can program it in to RIBA stage 4. And as we spoke about principal designers earlier, so as part of the Building Safety Act, every building now needs a principal designer. However, for high risk buildings, HRBs, I have heard them referred to as high-rise buildings, but it is higher risk buildings, the principal designer needs enhanced competencies. And the RIBA are actually putting together a list of accredited principal designers that can work on higher risk buildings. So it's really about that competency and making sure that the team around you, which we spoke about earlier, is the right team. And the principal designer will want to review your Gateway 2 submission before it's gone to the Building Safety Regulator. It's also important to note that the responsibility for the compliance rests with the person carrying out the work, not the Building Safety Regulator. So it rests with us as designers. Even if the Building Safety Regulator has signed it off and said it's okay, we are the ones that need to ensure the compliance, and we will be the ones that are liable. So it's putting a lot more onus on us as designers, and again it's going back to that competency and having the right people around us to make sure that we're all working together to achieve the right product. But all of this is obviously creating a huge potential for inactive periods and delays. So we've got a principal designer coming in, reviewing the drawings. We finish the drawings, they need a period of time to review it. It then gets submitted to the Building Safety Regulator. They need their 12 weeks to review it. and then you can start to site. So you can see how it's already elongating the programme of the whole building. Now, I'm going to look at 3 different procurement types and just look at how it can, this new system can be affected on each of them. So if we start with construction management, so this is just a very simplified design programme of how the production could work. So working with the design packages and then getting earlier involvement from the specialists. You can see there in the diagram, and then we go to the Building Safety Act principal designer, who is a third party who will check and submit the drawings. It then goes to the building safety regulator, the 12-week review starts, and then we can start on site. Now this, we did actually mention this a bit earlier, it could result in a reduction in the consultant scope because we're getting specialists in early. So we actually may have to do less because we've got more work from the specialists. And everything we've spoken about today, earlier subcontractor specialist input is imperative to all of this. And we also somebody mentioned this earlier, that we may see a reduction in supply chains, which will allow for earlier decisions on products and systems. So, having less to choose from may be a better thing to actually allow us to speed up this process. So if we look at a design and build single stage tender, so you've got your consultant designing or developing the drawings to a stage 3 plus stage 4. I'm sure a lot of you know this, but then you go to tender, contractor is appointed, contractor then completes the design to get to gateway 2 with the consultants. It then goes to the principal designer to review, building safety regulator, review period, and then start on site. So this can be a lot less efficient, you can see, in this whole process, because there's potential for a lot of abortive work, because obviously as the consultants, we're developing the design, developing the system, developing all the details without any contractor input. And then obviously when the contractor comes on, there's going to be changes. So again, you can just see that it's a longer design period, less efficient, and abortive work. If we look at design and build 2-stage tender, which is I think what most of us are alluding to today, is that as consultants we develop the drawings to stage 2, stage 3, we get early contractor input at stage 3, that's informing our details, informing the design, making sure we're choosing the correct systems, making sure we're choosing the correct materials. Then contractor is appointed fully, completes the design, and so goes on, principal designer, building safety review, and then start on site. I think it's also important to note here that I did mention it earlier, that our understanding is that the building safety regulator, if you want to change a material later on, will not accept a change in material just based on cost, even if the performance is exactly the same. So it's really imperative that we all collaborate together to make sure that we get to a point that we're not going to require any changes. And if we do require changes, everything on site stops until the building safety regulator has reviewed it, approved it, and then we can start again. So there's a huge potential for delays, but if we can work together, and I think that's the thing that's really important, is that this is affecting all of us, and the only way we're going to get through this and navigate it is working together and not against each other. And so as I mentioned, early contractors, we can ensure the contractors' proposals and gateway to submission are achieved earlier, less abortive work, and potentially allowing the product to come to market earlier. What does this mean for the future? So in summary, I think what we're all talking about today is competency is key, and making sure that we have the right people around us and that we as professionals actually understand what we're talking about, what we're doing, all the regulations, making sure that we're up to scratch on everything that's coming out. But stepping away from procurement and building, I just wanted to highlight a few points which I think personally this new Building Safety Act isn't addressing. So we have a housing crisis in the UK, and now is not the time to inhibit innovation and drive the fear of single stair buildings, which is what we spoke about earlier, because we have a whole stock of single stair buildings. What is happening to them? And when I talk about innovation, we not only do we have a housing crisis, we also have a huge sustainability crisis. And we've got to also remember that in amongst the safety of buildings, we've got this challenge for sustainable buildings. And the only way, in my opinion, that we're going to get to carbon zero in 2030, 2050, whatever the goalpost is now, because it's changing, is through innovation. And we need to make sure that all these regulations allow us to be innovative as designers and actually address safety, sustainability and quality. And with the single stair buildings, as I mentioned earlier, risk should be considered holistically and proportionally. And the staircase is only a small part of the building. And you've got sprinklers, you've got evacuation, lifts, you've got all of these things that need to be thought about holistically. And we shouldn't be just politically saying, add another second stair in, everything's going to be great, building safe, because in reality, it probably isn't. And one of my biggest pet hates at the moment is the redesign of course, putting staircases just anywhere in that course and saying it's safe, where in reality, what you need is a true second means of escape. So as you come out of your apartment, you need to be able to choose right or left, not right and then there's 2 stairs. So it's about really making sure that we're not just listening to the media and doing what they think we want to do, but actually understanding it properly. And then finally, there is a bit of a contradiction going on at the moment, because from the planning side, they really want us to design dual aspect apartments. Now, however, when you add a second stair and additional circulation, it becomes very difficult to actually design true dual aspect apartments. So for us as designers, it's a huge challenge out there. How do we make a safe building, a sustainable building, a beautiful building, but not forgetting that at the end of the day, it's a residential building and it's the quality of the apartment that somebody lives in as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That's a really helpful insight into an architect's world, which I'm glad I'm not on your side of the... moving on, we're going to have a further panel discussion, which is going to be chaired by Keelan. It's a very broad subject. Probably kept this till last, just for the fact that it's probably people have got a lot of questions in their minds now, based on their perspective and their position in the market. But it surrounds the opportunities and the threats that the Building Safety Act poses to the market. There's certainly massive opportunities, but there's certainly also massive threats depending on who you are. So, slight tweak to the panel as we did earlier, but we've got Tom Gilbert, Tim Gahary, Paul McClellan from Sweco, Neil's colleague, Peter Wise, sorry.
I think Debbie's coming on for Tim.
Oh, sorry Tim, apologies. We loved you so much earlier, we want to do you again, but sorry we can't. And yes, Debbie, and Peter Wise from Part B, and Joe Celia from the FIS. Thank you.
Afternoon everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces. I'm really excited to be chairing this panel because we've got an absolutely awesome subject. And as Lewis has said, we're going to be going through some of the threats and some of the opportunities that are coming out of the Building Safety Act. If you like, I've asked some of the panellists to give maybe a positive and then a negative about the Act that's bringing changes to the construction industry that we live and work in. So we'll kick straight off. I'm going to start off with Tom actually, if that's all right. And Tom, I think you've mentioned here that one of the real opportunities that you're seeing come out of the Act is actually increased certainty. And whether that be in relation to design and buildability, but I think you've actually mentioned REBA Stage 5 there, and that being good news for builders. So looking forward to hear what you've got to say about that.
Yeah, so just to be very, very clear, I don't think there's any certainty in the early bit at all yet. But I think I don't actually think it's all doom and gloom. I think the front end of the project and the overall time frame of the project is a very, very complicated process. But I think the reality is, if we are truly able to deliver the scope of what the BSA is telling us to deliver, then in theory as a builder it's really, really good news. If you are the person that is managing a site, then you've got certainty from day one that your design is all ready to go, all your products have been selected, everything is compliant, it will all fit together perfectly. And you see there's a certain irony in that's never going to happen. But the reality is, from a builder's perspective, then you know that you're going to get a sensible set of instructions and a decent kit of parts, and in theory it should go together really, really well, rather than the kind of the constant, what we call Stage 5 design, where you're kind of trying to do workarounds on site. So in theory it takes that away, which is great news for your constructor. The other bit, the uncertainty, is bad news for probably the overall kind of and develop that, and potentially the designer as well.
Because I think you've got an opinion on that, Joe. You often quote about designing and building, but we often build before we design.
Well, it should be design and build, and what we do is we build and we design as we're going along. And I think one of the big opportunities for this, as I think was said earlier on, and I like the phrase, you get an Airfix kit with the instructions, you know what you've got to do and you know you've got it work. I mean, there are lots of things that touch on what Paul was saying that I'll try and pick up on later where those risks are, but completely agree. It's a good thing, I think, for the industry.
Good stuff. And I'm going to move over to you, Debbie, now, because one of the opportunities that you've brought forward is more about collaboration and earlier engagement. And you've spoken about the PC being involved earlier on so that they know more about the project earlier on in the stages.
Yes, I think looking at the architectural presentation we've just had, if we're going to go down the existing route of D&B, I think there are still issues because it's becoming very obvious that we need to actually all collaborate a lot earlier. I think the front end has got to be a lot more weighted, but it's actually making sure that we have those competencies, and probably we're all speaking to the converted here at the end of the day, and we're all here because we want to understand it. There's an awful lot of people out there who probably don't understand it, don't want to understand it, or have no idea what's out there. And I think that's actually a big area where we've all got to get involved and start cooperating as well. How do we actually involve the supply chains? How do we broaden all of those aspects that we've been talking about today? There is a huge mountain to climb and we all have to start somewhere, but I think it is going to be quite a massive change in the industry.
And I think, Paul, you noted this, a similar point down, so.
Yes, so I think when we talk about Building Safety Act and we concentrate, or predominantly we're looking at high-rise residential buildings, excuse me, within the Building Safety Act, what's also occurred is that there is an upskilling of the industry that's required in terms of this principal designer role, which affects every single scheme. So whilst we're concentrating, and a lot of the talks today is about the HRB work, the principal designer role is actually, I think there's a lack of understanding that this applies now to all buildings, so the client has to appoint a principal contractor or a principal designer on all schemes, all commercial schemes anyway. And actually how that gets taken forward into construction. So these people, as Neil alluded to earlier, have now legal responsibilities. So if they design something that's actually got a contravention on it, and that contravention gets taken through into construction, then actually the building safety regulator or the health and safety executive, who are the overarching governing body of all building regulations now, actually have got a very nice line of people to line up there to prosecute for building in that contravention. So I think there's a lack of understanding of actually what's coming in kind of by stealth really in the background. Also the focus has been on the HRBs, and more people die in low-rise buildings, as we heard earlier on, than actually in HRBs. So we've got to get it right across the spectrum.
It's very interesting. And you mentioned the legal responsibilities there. I don't know if anyone else has got another opinion on that, or Tom, if you've got anything on that. I know when I've been talking to architects, they have been mentioning obviously what could affect them as taking, if they do take the principal designer role, not always they do. But I don't know if you've got any opinions on that.
No, I mean, from my perspective as a contractor, the way in which I think organisations solve their problem in that space, particularly kind of selfishly, I was going to say fire stopping then, but I knew you'd throw something out. We're going to have to change the company name to a long list of British standards, aren't we? But I think, the solution for me is it's all about early engagement. Early engagement is absolutely critical, and I think, we as an organisation are very fortunate to work with a lot of tier ones who are exceptional at what they do, and I'm quite fortunate there's a lot of my clients in the room, so Mace in particular, I don't know where they are, but so we do an awful lot of early engagement with Mace, and I think the beauty of that is they've seen the light. That engaging early with a specialist contractor gives them a lot more certainty at stage 5. There are a lot less problems during stage 5, and that certainty and assurance is critical. But the reality that's best practice currently, and what will happen is that will become mandated best practice that everyone will have to deliver. And I think in my market in particular, I worry whether the market can cope with that level of early engagement, because the competency around early engagement is completely different to kind of filling holes and spraying beams, for want of a better word, So I think how does just passive fire, a very, very small facet of that, how does that part of the world gear up its competence to be able to appropriately design to all these clients at the same time, because it's not going to be progressive. Everyone's going to need it day one, right? So I think, but that's the solution is competent early engagement to kind of mitigate against your legal liabilities.
Mm-hmm. Go on, Peter. You were about to say something.
Yeah, just really going to pick up on something that Tom said about the way in which the regulations really do line up a list of people who are lawyers. And having been a regulator and worked very closely with HSE, I think that encapsulates the whole point that it's not the regulator who designs the buildings, it comes down to the individuals who are responsible. So they're in the best case, it should be in the best position to articulate why they're creating a safe building. So effectively HSE in many ways, or building control ever, looking very much on process and then where it's gone from, which then comes back to the issue of that competency. Because I'm sure we could all agree that a group of competent people will design a building regardless of the regulations and such. So that's where it sits. And I think one of the things that from the BSA point of view is something that's writ true across what everyone's been talking about this morning, is that the BSR seems to be concentrated very much on high-risk residential buildings, doesn't it? But actually there's a lot more to it, which things, for example, the regulation of the building control industry, the product standards and all those kinds of issues are actually in there that affect all buildings, that are really important and are really in many ways, I think, the true story of Judy Hackett's report and what's following on. In some ways, high-risk residential buildings are a small subset of that, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Pete. And Debbie, just picking up on the competency point, I know this is a passionate subject of yours. You mentioned life safety training and fire safety awareness here, but do you want to say something about competency and about what you're doing in your field?
Yeah, I think it's also, it's not just the people probably in the room here, it's also have we actually educated the clients? And I think the clients are going to have to understand the changing in the contracts and the weighting of things, but also the fact that we've all got to collaborate and work together. The cooperation, I think, has become obvious for all of us today. What we've been looking at from CHSG's point of view is how do we actually help the contractors and the supply chain to actually build some sort of structure within their businesses to actually ensure that competency is starting to come into how they put their roles and responsibilities into their day-to-day, because they're going to be just as carefully looked at as the PDs, and rightly so, and the architects. But actually, when you're a tier 1 contractor or a smaller contractor, how do you actually manage all of those people who you probably don't employ, but actually they're coming onto your site? And what does competency mean? Because it's all very well for somebody to turn up with a card and a piece of paper or whatever. What does it actually mean? And I know we have the definitions with experience and expertise and knowledge and behaviour, but when you're at the sharp end and somebody turns up on a Monday morning, what are we actually going to look for, and how do we set a standard? And I think if we all go off and set up our own little areas of how we think competency should be, I think as an industry what we're trying to do is talk to a lot of the contractors to actually say, can we help you to actually build something? So if you go from one contractor to another, a piece of paper is valid and somebody says, I've got one of these that's got X on, actually it's fully understandable to the person that they go to work for in 2 months' time, 2 years' time, whatever it is. And I think we have a responsibility to try and do that.
Thank you very much. Joe was just about to burst with something there. So.
Yeah. Competency is a really complicated subject, I think more complicated in some ways than even one of Paul's flowcharts. We've got, there's organisational competence, so organisations need to be competent to deliver what they're doing as an organisation. But the other thing is that the people within it also need to be competent, and understanding that competence in a real simple term like scares people. So I work for a trade body called FIS, and our members are involved in the fit-out sector, the stuff that makes the inside of the building the inside of the building. And we're running through a process with them, really, really simple, to say, start to list what you know. Start with knowledge. Start to understand what you know, and where you can, show where it came from. Was it toolbox talk? Was it a demonstration? Did you learn something on site? And then where did you take that knowledge and build some experience? So where did you go out to site and use that, and what did you do and what did you learn? But that doesn't make them competent. That just means they know how to drive a car. What they need to do then is to develop a skill, and the skill, from my point of view, is I can do that thing with that product unsupervised. That's whatever it is. So whether it's planning, whether it's drawing, whether it's calculations, I can do that unsupervised. The final bit is the behaviours, and again the behaviours of people go, I don't understand what that means, what's that? So if you're a carpenter, one of the first things they'll tell you is to measure it twice, cut it once, and to keep your finger out of the saw when it's going round. Really simple things. That's an example. Pharmaceuticals have done it, the finance people have done it as well. So I think if everybody in the room today, you look at yourselves on that, what knowledge have I got, where have I got the experience in doing that, what skills do I think I have, and what behaviours have I got, and then start to look at what will that allow me to do, and the thing that I think is missing in all of this, with what products. So Paul is a deep knowledge expert when it comes to a whole stack of stuff, predominantly around ducts and dampers and the M&E side of things. Doug with doors, but if you ask them to swap over, there'll be crossover, but yet they wouldn't be competent, but yet they're both competent. So it's understanding the product that you're using as well. So there's a lot to learn, but I think if we break it down into those simple terms and start to look at your own competency, you'll start to be able to understand it for others. Thank you.
Go on, Paul.
Yeah, and I think just to expand on that, I think you've also then got to look at the culture within your organisation as well. So from a building control perspective, we could have the best design, we've checked it, we've approved it, we go to site and the design is completely changed, it's been undertaken by somebody who's not necessarily competent to install that product, and we see this from a building control perspective still on a day-to-day basis where products are just being thrown up and it looks like, oh yeah, that'll do, it's satisfactory, can you sign it off for us? So the cultural organisational awareness, so you might have the best company in the world that can demonstrate their competency, but if you're employing people who don't believe in your ideology, then all you're doing is you're just building failure in down the line. And a lot of the schemes that I deal with, residential refurbishment schemes that were built in 2007, actually the buildings are built in an absolute horrific state, and that's not because it was designed incorrectly, that's because it was constructed incorrectly and it wasn't supervised. So it's cultural change within the person who's granular doing the work all the way to the people sort of like sat in the room doing the design work.
Good, thank you, Paul. Now I'll just move on to the last opportunity, which is one that I think we'd all agree with, and that's just talking about the end product. I know Tom's passionate about the subject because he put it down, but really, the end product, what we're actually trying to get out of the change that's coming is, I guess, is a product we can give to the end user that's better than what we've got at the moment.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the thing, well, you've written down what I said, but you took out capital letters for perceive. So it does say perceived improvement to safety. Well, it was perceived, right, as in it's only imaginary, right? So I think the whole purpose of this is about having a better quality, safer product at the end. That's what all of this is about, and indeed to ensure that building can be appropriately managed and maintained for its life cycle, whatever that is. And I think the problem is that I think if we lose sight of what we are trying to achieve, then it will just be a perception. The whole process will exist. We will all kind of muddle our way through the process and kind of forget why we're actually doing what we're doing. And I think if we realise that the previous regime is why we got to the event that happened that made the Building Safety Act turn up, I think it should all give us some confidence actually that the reason we are here is because actually either we weren't very good at designing things, we weren't very good at building things, we weren't particularly good at designing and creating products, we weren't very good at interfacing them together, we were awful at watching it being made, and nobody really had a holistic idea about what was going on in the first place. So I think if we acknowledge that's why we got to where we are, then all this is it's just tightening that up. It's just making sure everyone talks, everyone understands what's going on. We're thinking holistically about the right things. We're thinking about risk and occupant safety and customer experience rather than cost and speed at which we can build it. Acknowledging those things are important, but that shouldn't be the core driver for what we're trying to design. So I think fundamentally having the customer at heart is what this should be all about. And I think, by virtue of the fact the room's full, I think there's a lot of people that are intrigued at how that works, and I think it's a good thing.
Good. Well, that kind of wraps up our opportunities. I'm going to have to move on to some of the threats because some of the threats that came out are really interesting. They do kind of cross over with some of the opportunities. And I'm going to jump to Debbie straight away because she mentioned about the commercial viability of buildings and the fact that with the uncertainty and maybe some increased upfront design costs, is that going to make buildings less commercially viable? How's that going to play out?
I think we're at almost like a fork in the road, aren't we, in a way? Can we actually look at the manufacturing and the modular side? Can we make some buildings, and I know some of the architects will be horrified, can we modularise things, make things more cost effective? I mean, I came from a manufacturing background. I spent many years running factories. I was horrified when I came into the construction industry at maybe the KPIs, the inefficiencies and the complexity of doing everything a first time round. I became used to it and sadly I probably joined in with a whole setup. But looking at the two now, you actually think, you know, if we're doing a shopping precinct, there's only so many ways you can build a Boots and Marks and Spencers and various other things. Can't we make things easier and put your lists from maybe your presentations earlier, we've got things that we can drop out of the box and do more effectively. If we're going to have, you know, a very iconic building, that will be very bespoke and we could do that in a different way. So there are skills that we still want. But I do think that an educated client is, and I'm probably going to be shouted down, is probably something that maybe a lot of you deal with, but there's not a lot of them around out in the marketplace. Are they going to understand what we're trying to do? Will they want a modular building is the other one as well. But I do think that, I don't think this act really has been brought forward in the fact that it is going to change probably the way we construct, the way we look at things and how we're going to educate either end of those chains. And then at the other side, when you look at the costs, if you're held up at the end, you can't get your certificates. You know, somebody's going to be jumping up and down because there's all this huge space that they want to actually use, and there won't be a means of finding that cost now. So I think the world has a huge threat in the commercial change, and have we actually put that out well enough?
Go on, Paul, I think you were.
Yes, and again, it's pulling it all back into the understanding of what the new world looks like. So again, the principal designer role now, and I was with a large architectural practice just yesterday, and I was explaining what my interpretation of this role is. So this role is now written into legislation. It came into force on the 1st of October. An architect or the principal designer, the client is appointing either the PC or the principal designer. They are now certifying the design and they're certifying that the construction meets all building regulations. For me to serve an initial notice on a project now, which is not a HRB, I have to take that duty holder name, I have to put it onto the certificate, and I have to get a signed declaration at the end. And just the other day somebody said, what does this actually mean? And it says, well, it means that you can no longer turn around and say building control have approved this, it's acceptable. It means that you're now taking responsibility for this design and for the construction. Just building on it.
It's good, thank you, Paul. And then I think Pete's going to lead us quite well into Pete's point about a lack of knowledge and understanding as being one of the threats to where this is playing out. And I think you mentioned in particular in relation to fire engineering, which is obviously your background.
Yeah, what it's really set is, I think I've seen, you know, being sort of long in the tooth, I've seen in a regulator and seen various regulations coming and changing. There's always uncertainty, but this I think is obviously a degree and a magnitude beyond that because of the areas in which we've had change. And I think one of the areas that I find is difficult is obviously uncertainty is always going to be difficult commercially and professionally. We'd expect a period of that, but how can anybody invest with certainty about what's going to be at the end, especially when you change from a regime which was led by an understanding of functional requirements that you were comfortable with to a regulator having to sign something off, which in many ways goes back to the old form of regulation that I'm familiar with, the Fire Precautions Act and things of that nature, which it's got benefits and minuses, but sort of certain experience with the BSA, with the new regulator and the HSE coming into the built environment, concerns over their firstly capacity. I think that's going to affect the industry significantly. And there's obviously that's linked to other regulators, building control officers and fire safety arena, the fire authorities I'm particularly familiar with. There is a significant lack of capacity, and also I'd suggest competency in those areas while people are upskilled to dealing with different areas. And then finally, I will mention it again, they're throwing things with 2 staircases coming in from political angles. Quite understand where that's come from, but that does not help anybody in the industry whatsoever. Certainly where that particular aspect has come from, I'd say the court of common sense as opposed to consider professional opinion in the way it should have done. They should have handled that area. So that's really the issue that I've got.
Thank you. And what we often see, we do see it on projects. I'm just moving on to Joe's next point, is about subcontractor becoming the unintentional designer, and that lack of knowledge and that uncertainty plays its way down through where you've put a project into the specification, right down to where the subcontractor is actually going to install it, and it doesn't quite tie up, so they become the unintentional designer.
I think the whole thing of the unintentional designer was brought forward to me on a project today, which was almost complete, and somebody's put the wrong screws in. They're not long enough. They're not long enough to screw the boards to the CLT. The job's almost done because somebody simply has procured the wrong screws. The biggest threat I think that we've got is at the trade counter. You can imagine somebody turning up at a trade counter and he said, I've run out of that fireproofing stuff. You know the stuff I mean? You know the pink stuff? I've got. What have you got? And out comes, well, we've got some stuff over there, and they don't look at the parameters, they don't look at what it can be done, and it gets sold. So there's that lack. There's a huge amount of training that needs to be done, particularly where people are selling stuff. The concern that I have is that construction is very much anybody in construction. If somebody says, "How would you do that?" you start to think about it. You start to plan it. How is that grill working in that ceiling? How is that upstanding work? What's happening around the door? You just do. It's just part of what we do. So we're happy to help, but we're not ASDA. That was the best I could do, Doug. Sorry, it was the best. I do need your script writer. And so it's even still. So competence is key, and that competence is not just knowing that you're competent to do something, but actually understanding what you're not competent to do as well.
Thank you, Joe. We've got time for one more threat. I'm going to move down to actually one of Tom's, because I don't think it's really been mentioned too much today. It's about potentially the threat of certain residential developers actually exiting the market and then not being able to meet those output numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest risks out there, actually. I know for a fact there are already tier 1 contractors that are getting out of residential construction. They perceive it to be far too risky from their perspective. And some of the conversations I've had, well, if you think about it, it's the least risk you'll ever experience in residential, because obviously I'm fire safety focused, and they say, we're not talking about fire, we're not worried about that bit, it's the money, it's the uncertainty that exists, it's the increase in kind of overall project length. And as a result of that, you'll probably get some of the most educated clients in theory starting to exit the market in residential and start to focus on the stuff they do have control over, which is commercial building, right? Where fire engineers can do fire engineering stuff still, and they can still be innovative, and we can all get around the table and solve some cool problems. So I think that inherently is one of the big issues, and I think the point that Nisa made around we're in a housing crisis, right? We've got massive problems with housing numbers, housing shortages. The 2 staircase thing reduces the amount of NIA within the building straight away. So actually every building you build will have less apartments in them, or they'll be smaller depending on which way you go. But if you think about that kind of cradle to grave time frame, although we're accepting the build will still take the same amount of time, the design might be a little bit shorter, but overall let's say there's a 12 to 15 month increase in programme. In theory, we don't deliver anything from the day it starts for a whole year. We actually get a year of nothing being built in that high-rise space, because nothing can be built yet, and it will take longer to build because stage 4 and stage 5 won't overlap like they used to. And I think that's kind of an unintended consequence of the situation we face. So as a result of that, do you then have a problem with housing shortages, prices of housing going up? Do you then see less social housing because it's in the developer's interest to sell more at market rate? And that causes all sorts of problems well beyond fire and structure and design. That's huge political related problems. So I think that's kind of the unintended outcome of this. You get safer buildings, they just happen a lot slower, and for a whole year, in theory, nothing's going to get finished.
And just to expand on that a little bit further, so whilst the Building Safety Act is set up via the gateways and it's a 12 weeks delayed, we've also got a good number of buildings across the country that are currently in a bit of a cladding crisis. So I was with a client just yesterday afternoon. We were talking about a high-rise residential building that's going to the BSA for regulation. And actually what we said is that when you get to refurbishment scheme, you can't necessarily guarantee what that design's going to be. So when you take something off a building, you see the building for the first time, the skeleton of the building, and actually you find that design that you've just had approved for the last 8 weeks, because it's 8 weeks of a refurbishment, actually now needs to stop. You've got scaffolding up, you have to go back to the BSR for 6 more weeks because you have to change your design, but it's not just 6 weeks with the BSR, it's the design. So you have to, once you see an issue, you have to design that issue. So that might take 2 to 3 weeks, then 6 weeks with the BSR. So now you've got a building that can't progress because it's a fundamental point and it's actually just sat there with dangerous cladding on, waiting for the BSR to make that decision, whereas in the old regime, that could be quite a quick and fluent process.
Thank you, Paul. That brings us actually towards the close. Conscious we've covered quite a range of topics there, so hopefully that's got everyone's minds thinking, because we're going to have a Q&A session now, and there's going to be a chance for anyone to ask any questions to any of the panellists, any of the people that have spoken today. Nice is there, I think, at the back there we go, yeah. So feel free to mention someone you want to put a question to.
My name's Matt Hode from HTA Design. It's a question, I think, for part B. It's to do with the scope of what we would expect from a fire engineer. We're very used to the fire engineering strategy. But when it comes to more detailed topics, for example, if a manufacturer has a test, they don't always stand by the development of the test for the system. So you could end up with a construction system that has a test for a nice piece of wall. You can put a window or door through. There's no one there to do the detailing. So the contractor will often say, that's down to the fire engineer. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yes, I've got certain views on that phrase, down to the fire engineer. And it goes back to my feelings when we ended up with the EWS1 fiasco. It's got to be signed off by a chartered fire engineer. And I know lots of chartered fire engineers, I wouldn't let them near a residential building because that's not their area of expertise, quite rightly. And we get this because we obviously get asked that question, and to come back to the field design, desktop studies and those kinds of areas. I think if you're going to say, well, it goes back to the fire engineer, it depends what you mean. And I don't necessarily think the fire engineer is always the right person to sign that off, if at all. And we need to go back to the appropriate experts. So we will spend a lot of our time presently talking to manufacturers about design details, which is often about, have you got the test details, is your test detail applicable? That kind of very first level looking at field application stuff. But I don't necessarily think the fire engineer is always the right person. It's just, it seems to have become that kind of, I'll ask the fire engineer, which is probably why insurance has gone up catastrophically, you know. And the fact of the matter, other people won't sign stuff off. I think you have to be regular about what you're asking people to do, making sure they're competent in those areas, firstly. So even within fire engineering, you get fire engineers who specialise in fire strategies, and then, you know, the fire engineer could be a sprinkler designer, I don't know. You'll be very, very careful about what you're asking as a client.
Thank you.
Matt, this is exactly what's on my desk at the moment, completely on my desk. So Paul is part of a group called the Passive Fire Knowledge Group, which is where tier 1 contractors have come together and go, do you know what, we've got a problem? Oh, we've got a problem. And they realise it's the same problem running through. So we're about to publish a thing called Walls as a System, and the whole thing about Walls as a System, we test them in perforate, we get them on site and we pepper them with holes, so we just do. So there's two words for me. One is interface and the other is PI. Whatever products you put in will always interface with something else on the site. PI, there are a group of people who are those experts out there in drywall construction. The problem is, I think there's no more than that. And that's the problem. There are not enough competent people. And one of the things I was going to raise about risks, and please forgive me about using the word man, but in the world of the blind, a one-eyed man is king. You must have heard that time and time again. And what I'm concerned about is that there are people out there with 2 years experience in selling a product are now going on and they're inspecting for all the wrong reasons. And I'm also seeing out of the box solutions. If you want golden thread solution, there's several of them now. Let me tell you, we've got a solution for this and solution for that. We're still learning, so there can't be solutions out there. So sort of tread with caution. Matt, you want to see me later, I can point you in some directions.
Thank you. Just on that, I think the important point there is that from a fire engineer perspective, is in the part given to the fire engineer works alone, and that's something certainly that we've taken forward in our company. These fire engineers, the design team, and when they're looking at details, work with other professionals to assess things. You've got to understand the limits of your knowledge, the one-eyed man in the kingdom or whatever, but then, hopefully you can get to the extent where you do understand what you're doing and come to a full conclusion. But that also is recognising the first level of competency of saying, well, actually, I'm not competent to do that job. That's one of the really important issues. It doesn't help people, I know, because there is as you were saying, a lack of people across the piece available to do lots of different things. But that's where we've got to be honest if we are going to be competent.
Good, thank you.
Hi, name's Guillermo from Sketch Design. I've got this question about what's going to happen with refurbishments. I mean, Paul was mentioning the fact that until you do the dilapidation, you're not going to find out what's going on the building. Therefore, you're going to have to then design the whole, to do all the specification of all the parts of the building in order to just to be able to submit. And it's just, in some cases, it may be a small thing you want to do on an existing higher risk building, and then it has to go through all this process. It's just not going to be viable at all. I mean, I don't know if you, because I've seen all these responses about, it all seems about new building and.
So there's two real parts of the question here. So the first one is if something is an emergency responsive repair. So you can do that work and then retrospectively apply to the regulator. So if it's an emergency, i.e. a fire door, and you need to repair that fire door straight away, you can put that in and then make the application to the regulator and say we had to do this to maintain the building safety. Secondly, where it's not an emergency responsive repair, you have to go through the gateway process, and ultimately what I imagine there is that you're doing a lot more investigation work to ensure that the design fulfills the requirements of the regulator. The cladding schemes I was on with yesterday, the contractor couldn't quite fathom that actually what they're going to be doing on these schemes is potentially opening up and then potentially waiting for 6 weeks. And they was like, well, who's paying for that? Because we can't work on the external wall because that's what we're looking at. Whilst we deal with some passive fire protection that we didn't know was missing. So the regulator, I think, must have to have a process of speeding that up, but at the moment it's a minimum of 6 weeks. And again, that's for every major change it's called. So if it's a minor change, you can actually just do that as long as you notify and record it. If it's a major change, it has to be back to the regulator and stop the work on that particular element. So hopefully you're doing more than one thing on the site and you can go on to something, but if it's a refurb and a cladding job, I'm not quite sure what else you can do.
It is a problem though, isn't it? Because you can actually go onto the building and you have no idea what's actually the fabric of the building until you start, and that could actually be a huge weight, and I don't think people have really thought about it at the end of the day. If we're all honest, I think some of the contractors who turn up to do refurbishments, it must be very difficult and the thought must be quite daunting. And it's also your insurances now as well. I know that there are certain people who are, especially PDs maybe, but also going on to the contracting side, they're now looking at what they're signing up for, what they're responsible for, maybe the weights, maybe the interruptions of time, how people have written it into the contract, and that can actually be make and break in your cash flows, your insurance costs, etc., etc. I think it's not an easy one. I think, yes, if you're doing it from scratch and it's a new build, it's not easy, but it's an easier way to start. I think, yes, you've identified one that's very difficult.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Directed more at contractors. We haven't said much about procurement practices and contractual practices, and given that really was what lay at the heart of the Grenfell problem or procurement, we assume that there's going to be changes needed, especially to safeguard early involvement. Is there anything to be said about that?
I suppose as the only contractor, I guess I'll take that one. So yeah, I think so. I think in truth, I don't think there is the right level of understanding yet about how people are engaged and at what point in the process. And I think that's something that will turn up in time. But I mean, you know, at what point do you engage your constructor, and in what way do you engage them, and under what contract? If the design isn't finished, how do you do that? You know, so there is also an unintended consequence of stage 4 finishing before stage 5. Is that, you know, if you're going to procure your builder, when do you procure them? Does that happen after the design is finished, so they can see the design to be able to price it, or does it happen during stage 4 before it's finished being designed? And if you don't know if it's going to get approval, you know, you might have to do that again. You know, so I think that is a big issue, unless it is a kind of a turnkey constructor, which is kind of the D&B route, which is the least efficient way. So I think there's a huge amount of thought about it, and I just want to point at someone at the back who might work for a large tier 1 to have an opinion on it other than me. But safe to say we'll get engaged more early, I think, as a passive fire protection contractor, both for us and for the client, I suppose.
There are some of the contractors are coming to us at the moment. We are starting and we're being asked to design courses for procurement because they need to understand that they can't change things, or they have to understand what they are procuring. So I think there are some people who are becoming very proactive and thinking that you've got to go back through the stages. So your specialisations aren't just during your build or the early stages. You actually have to think of everybody in the team as a holistic approach. And I think that's going to be quite important, because we've all got to understand where we all link into each other. And I think as a big company, that's probably easier because the team works there. If you actually have a smaller business, you've got to engage with all of those different ones, and I think that is going to be more difficult. So I think your point is very valid.
Yeah, and also add into that, what happens if one of your contractors goes bust?
Yeah.
What happens if your facade installer goes bust? What does that do to your critical path? You know, we don't know the answer to that question, but these are the questions we're all asking, I suppose.
Or you can't get raw materials,
Yeah,
or something
absolutely.
shut down somewhere.
Yeah, 100%. Go on, Tom.
I'm not really sure what to add to that. My mum said it's rude. No, I think I wish I had a crystal ball on this. I think it could go kind of one or two ways. You could either it could force the market towards a more partnering approach where contractors get on board earlier, which obviously I would advocate as a contractor. Or it could go the opposite end, whereas I think you alluded to it goes towards more traditional contracting. You've got spec and drawings and you're back to, you know, pre-D&B days. It's really difficult. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, you know, if you boil Grenfell down, it's two things really, wasn't it? It was value engineering and product substitution without knowing what went into that building. And then ultimately it was because people weren't competent to know what went into that building. And I'm not sure that those scenarios won't be mitigated irrespective of contractual route or when people get on board. It all goes back to competency, it all goes back to choosing the right products. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it normalises out over the coming years. I say I'm a big advocate of collaborative working, get involved around the table together with kindred spirits and people that understand what they're doing, and we'll get the best outcomes. But we'll see how it goes.
Simon Taylor from Burn Group. About the risk, how do you see innovations being going forward? Because a lot of times clients want to move their risk onto principal contractors by innovation of architects and principal designers. Do you think that's going to now die because, risk is going to be too great for a principal contractor to take on? And so that risk now needs to stay and remain with clients, and they can't share the love like they used to.
It's difficult. Innovation actually, when it's difficult, isn't it? Because we used to see it as actually passing the buck, and actually then it was passing the liabilities and the responsibilities. And I think some of the Building Safety Act has actually clarified that in the table that we saw. It's going to be very clear who signed what document and where it goes. Whether you novate or you don't novate is a difficult one. I think whether the contractor has the insurances and the competencies to then take on all of the other responsibilities that are going on with the Building Safety Act, it's a difficult one.
I think the principal designer role of the client, there's three accountable people in a project now. It's the client, the principal contractor and the principal designer. that novation of risk between the two of them will be a discussion if it's a design and build contract, the principal contractor will try and probably novate the risk of the design back onto the architect. But that doesn't necessarily mean that architect is signing up for the risk, because the principal contractor will be the person that's on the signatory. The contractual risk is changed, but the accountable person is listed.
Hi, Neil again. Going back to this, when do you bring the contractor on board? I'm interested because it's about product availability, so you can get the expert saying this is the right one, but you know who's holding the supply chain. So can you get it? You might be right, can you get it? So how does that work? And also you could get something absolutely completely specified, and then it stops being available during it, so you stop because it's a major change because you can't get that product anymore.
Yeah.
So this establishing your supply chains is going to be critical. Who holds that? Because whoever holds that needs to be part of the engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think inherently that's going to be, in theory, the only point you could legitimately substitute a product. So if you can't do it on the basis of cost, so the basis of availability, I think is going to be the only time, in theory, that you can change it. But I think one of the things that I've noticed in some of the guidance that's come out since, obviously, the kind of secondary legislation has been built, is that, and it astonishes me really, because it was so great for me to read it. But I mean, there is a notifiable change. There's a list of now what the notifiable changes are. The one that astonished me was that if you change the number of builders' work openings that you have, their dimensions, right? So you not even change the numbers, if you change the dimensions of them, if you change the services that are going through them and the dimensions of those services going through them, it's a notifiable change. So you're now in a situation where all the stuff that we do at REBA Stage 5, which is we need to make a hole there because Paul wants to put a pipe through it, right? So we just that's another one to add to the list, and away you go. And I go, okay, no problem, I'll sort that out for you, Paul. Away we go, right? Brilliant. We do that all day long. You know, all of a sudden, if you move your builder's work opening, you change the numbers of builders' work opening. And how many times have we had a builder's work opening the size of a room and said, right, we're going to put 4 big things going through that, and so well, there's only a tested solution to have one.
We never do that, Tom.
No, not you. In fact, of all of the clients, Mace are the only ones that don't. But the point is the level of detail and control that the regulator expects over something just, I mean, if you think about a builder's work opening, they are absolutely everywhere. You knock a hole through a wall, Fireproof comes and fixes it for you, jobs are good and we all move on. We've now got to have all of those written with solutions for them, tested solutions for all of them, before we even put stuff in the ground. I mean, like, this is like well staffed, that is dramatic, let alone worrying about whether we get the right bat.
Just in picking up on that as well, in coordination sessions, we're at coordination sessions, and with best will in the world, everything's modelled. So you're sitting there with the designers and you're trying to work out those solutions. And I was in a meeting the other day and I said, so when we come on site, are we going to see any holes for cables that are not modelled, maybe going through a wall? You know, how are we identifying that level of detail? And then the chap said, well, actually, the sprinkler pipes are below 50 mil as well, so they're not modelled as well.
That was brilliant.
I was like, right, okay, so now we need to go through a list of what we don't know.
Yes, and if you make any of those holes, you need to tell the regulator about it now. And you then got the whole thing, you know, I'll give you a square that size, and we're going to put a service straight through the middle of it, Tom. You do your solution. We go, okay, no problem. Then we turn up on site, and it's there, but the pipe's here, right? Because it goes 30 metres into the sky, so it wasn't quite in the right place. We said, well, I can't give you a certified solution for that. And I said, well, why not?
And Tom, just to add to Tom's point, the point we're making earlier about these products is you've got to know what it was originally to the risk of the space. So if you're notifying because you've changed something, what are you notifying on, and do you actually understand what it was originally and what you're going to? Does that make sense? So the really hard thing with this, I think, when you get to Gateway 2, ideally at Gateway, you've got to have some knowledge of it, is actually understanding the classification of actually probably each pipe, each cable that goes on it. It's crazy. Then otherwise, you know, if you go to a great company like C11 and say, can you give me a solution, what have you got? And you go, well, it's just a couple of pipes and a bit of cable. It's not enough information. You've actually got to know what it is, what function it is. Because I think there was a couple of things, I think you said this now earlier, is that if you put a soil pipe in its H1, it might be H3 in the building regulations, that's still a safety critical product. Then you've got the Part B element, fire dampers are Part L, then Part B. Does that make sense? It's that whole shenanigan you've got to go through. Understand the product, because the worst thing is going to a regulator and saying, I've got to change the product, it's not for cost. What are you doing? I put a better classification in. Why is that? Because I don't know what I bought originally.
and then BT come along and just put the pipes and the cables through anyway.
They use a lump hammer though, not a drill. It's never a little hole, is it?
Someone, you only got a hammer, you only ever seen that, mate.
But this is about getting it right first time, isn't it? Yeah. We know that all of the problems on site, so if you take something like dry lining and you come to increase the size of the hole, the impact that might have on the stud arrangements, or if you've got a big opening above a door and then you've got a heavy door in there, and suddenly you've got to put additional steels in there, and those steels then need to be protected. Guess what? You've got delays, you've got cost. So I can see the ambition to get it right in the first place. Just on the list of sort of safety critical products and what they run through. So here's my beef. Here's my beef. Fire doors. We know about fire doors. Fire stopping. We know about fire stopping. We've heard about fire glass, fire seals, fire anything else, fire door. You know, just everything with fire. We've forgotten about the whole wall. Yeah. It's a fire wall. If we start to treat it as a fire wall and not just another petition, we'll get it right. The process, and I can understand how it works, you look at the space and you start to look at how that space is going to be divided. What's going where? Who's going where? Are they flats? Is it accommodation? So the very first thing you do is start to look at the compartmentation. So you straight away start to lean to specifying the wall. And then you look at the pipes and the ducting and everything else that's got to run through the building to make it work. And that interface. Those two things have got to come together at the same time. I'm looking for utopia on that.
Hi, it's Rebecca from RMF Raised Flooring. My question's for Joe. I know the FIS are doing loads on promotion of reuse, and obviously we do a big piece on the take back of raised access flooring. But obviously with that comes a number of legacy systems that, whilst the specification for raised flooring hasn't changed in a number of years, how do we look to be compliant on the reuse side, which is great for net zero? And how do we make sure that we're meeting all of the regulations as a specialist and small subcontractor?
Okay, have you got a car? Put your hand up if you've got a car. Okay, so do you know your registration number? If you've got your registration number, you look for your chassis number. If you took that into Halfords, they've got all the information that they need to know about that car now. That's where we've got to get to. So if you've got something like a raised access floor that you've taken out of a building, you've refurbished it, you put it back and you warrant it, you need to know what its performance attributes are, and you need to have a copy of those field of application. It's exactly the same with, so we're starting to see glazed petitioning coming out from one building and going into another building. So there is an appetite for sustainability, reducing carbon. We did, when the Romans left, what did we do with all their buildings? We took them down and we repurposed them. We did it the same with medieval castles. We need to do the same now with the building stock that we've got and start to look at urban mining. But at the same time, we've got this issue now of how do we ensure that what we're doing is compliant. And I think, Rebecca, what it comes down to is having that core information. We looked at PDTs and PDSs, so product data templates and product data sheets as being the key. When we saw Paul Morell at the beginning of the BIM journey, and we said, why don't you just tell us what to do? What he said was, we'll let Darwin sort it out. When it comes to PDTs and PDSs and the way that the information that we've got, it's all not necessarily interoperable, because we're using different classifications, we're using different orders to put them in. Some of it's PDFs, some of it's Excel spreadsheets. We need to get to a point where we know what we describe things in the same way. So when we talk about a stud, we're not talking about horse, we're not talking about something that we put it through, but we're talking about a main component of a wall. That's where we need to get to that. But the work that you're doing and the team have been doing there, I absolutely applaud.
Thank you.
Thank you to the panel and all your questions.
Good, thank you all, and thank you particularly to the panellists and speakers. Been an extremely informative day. I think two main key themes to run through it is education and collaboration. I come from a tradesman background, and as a tradesman, you go to site, you've got to hold your food, you've got to, okay, where's the hole, got my screwdriver, pink phone, done, you need to get out, go. You look at standards, processes as your enemy. Whereas I think that's where the education comes in. Because what I've liked about today is breaking it down. I know you have some complicated diagrams, Paul, but we're trying to simplify things, and that I think is really, really key and really, really important. I think if, with that education, people realise that it's not the enemy, this is the way things need to happen. And I think, and that takes us to the collaboration point of view, because with all that's happening, you can say, well, it's going to cost us more. But I think with the working together and the collaboration, and I know it's a bit of a buzzword, people say, oh, we work together. That's actually going to take really hard work, and it's going to probably involve some very robust conversations between manufacturers, architects, designers, main contractors, subcontractors. But if those are had up front and we work at that I think is where cost savings are going to come. So I think particularly for us as the manufacturers, we've got to put ourselves out there to work, and we can't just say yes to anything because we want to get the sale. It's actually what's right, what works, and we need to put the time and money and investment in, and work with you guys. So I think that's really what I've taken away from it is education and collaboration, and I think if as an industry we can work together to do that, it would genuinely be better. And as we said, it's for the end client, the people who are going to be living in those apartments, are they going to be safe? So that's good. Thank you very much, everyone.